long years ago, three men stood on a boat on the backwaters of Kerala. They made a pact. We will meet here again next year, they said, on this very boat, on this very river, and we will each have written a book by then. Well, a year passed, but no man steps in the same river twice, and though the men did meet, no one had yet written a book. Another year, they announced, and it shall be done. We shall write, we shall meet, and we shall share autographed copies of our book. Well, another year did pass, and the new year they arrived at was 2025, and one of those three men had actually written his book. That man is Vasant Dhar. A couple of years ago, Vasant Dhar, Lancelot Pinto, and I, we made a pact. Only Vasant has delivered. And what a book it is.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen, our weekly podcast on economics, politics, and behavioral science. Please welcome your host, Amit Varma.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen. My guest today is Vasant Dhar, a professor at the Stern School of Business and the Center for Data Science at NYU. Vasant wears many hats, and one of those is of a thinker who has been immersed in the world of artificial intelligence for almost half a century. We think of AI as something new, but Vasant encountered it in healthcare in the late 1970s. Then he went on to open what I think was the world's first machine learning based hedge fund in the 1990s, and is one of the deepest thinkers about AI and business that I know. We became friends about 5 years ago, and he has appeared once before on The Seen and the Unseen in episode 203, where he spoke about his fascinating journey from Kashmir to NYC. I urge you to listen to that also. He then began a podcast called Brave New World, which I produced for him until recently. It just touched 100 episodes, featuring guests like Daniel Kahneman, Scott Galloway, Eric Topol, Jan LeCun, Philip Tetlock, and so many other great thinkers. Vasant also writes a Substack, and has just released his book, Thinking with Machines, which is a life and times of AI through the life and times of Vasant. Magnificent book. Please pick it up. And for now, listen to this conversation. But first, let's take a quick commercial break. Do you want to read more? I've put in a lot of work in recent years in building a reading habit. This means that I read more books, but I also read more long-form articles and essays. There's a world of knowledge available through the internet, but the problem we all face is, how do we navigate this knowledge? How do we know what to read? How do we put the right incentives in place? Well, I discovered one way. A couple of friends of mine run this awesome company called CTQ Compounds at ctqcompounds.com, which aims to help people up-level themselves by reading more. A few months ago, I signed up for one of their programs called The Daily Reader. Every day for 6 months, they sent me a long-form article to read. The subjects covered went from machine learning to mythology to mental models and marmalade. This helped me build a habit of reading. At the end of every day, I understood the world a little better than I did before. So if you want to build your reading habit, head on over to CTQ Compounds and check out their Daily Reader. New batches start every month. They also have a great program called Future Stack, which helps you stay up to date with ideas, skills, and mental models that will help you stay relevant in the future. Future Stack batches start every Saturday. What's more, you get a discount of a whopping 2,500 rupees. 2,500 if you use the discount code UNSEEN. So head on over to CTQ Compounds at ctqcompounds.com and use the code UNSEEN. Uplevel yourself. Vasant, welcome to The Seen and the Unseen.
Thank you, Amit. It is great to be here.
You know, episode 203 of this show, which was a few years ago, was with you, and you were just about to launch your podcast then. And I produced your podcast for many, many, many episodes. So I've heard your voice so often talking about AI and asking great questions about it, thinking about it, etc., etc. And now eventually this book. So I want to sort of ask you about that time, that over these last 3 or 4 years, what are the ways in which you have changed the way that you think about AI? Like, what new things have you learned? What have you changed your mind on? What's been going on?
So, before we get started, I want to, I guess, tell your audience that you have actually impacted both the title of my podcast, which you chose, when we were talking about it, I think exactly 5 years ago.
Yeah, pretty much.
Like almost 5 years ago to the day, right? When we talked about the concept and you and you agreed to produce it, and you said, hey, I think we should call it Brave New World. it resonated with me instantly because, Brave New World was one of the two non-engineering books that I read in IIT.
Well,
The other one was Death of a Salesman, which is also brilliant.
we couldn't have called your podcast Death of a Salesman. So
Couldn't have called it that, yeah. So Brave New World was brilliant, and it really fit the theme of what I was thinking, right? Which is really about the world that our future selves would like to inhabit, and it sort of picks up on places where Huxley left off, right? Where he, I guess his question really, if I were to frame his broad level question, it was, what happens to human freedom, individuality, meaning, when we pursue social stability and happiness and all these nice things through technology and control, and so it was like a timeless book. And with AI coming to the picture, which had just, the term AI had sort of just been invented during Huxley's later years. In fact, I remember he did a interview with Mike Wallace in 1958, right? And AI was, came into existence in 1956. Where he was talking about his concerns, when people can be, manipulated through devices, he called them. And, here we are. A lot of the things that he's said have actually, turned out to be, I don't want to say true, but, we're sort of inhabiting that world that he envisioned. And so it was a good place to pick up and, with the question about now we have AI, that's sort of in full swing. And by the way, AI has changed so much even the last 5 years, right? And
Yes, totally.
I will answer your question. That seemed like a good place to pick up, where Huxley had left off, with, now that we had AI, and, we thought it was like pretty advanced 5 years ago, but it was nothing compared to what it is now. So it was a great place to pick up. Now, your other question, how has AI changed? Well, I think we will look at, in the future, we look at the world before GPT and after GPT, right? That will be one of the major discontinuities, in humankind. And, I started the podcast in 2020, December, and, ChatGPT came out almost 2 years later, right? End of November, early December 22. And things just completely changed. And it's interesting, if you were to ask me, what's the big deal about modern AI, right? What's really new about it? Like, what one or two things would you point to and say, this is what like really changed between, previous incarnations of AI and what we have now? Is number one, everyone can identify with it, and prior to that, it was just sort of this specialized field, with geeks and nerds, taking it forward and showing all kinds of magic, look, ma, no hands, look at all these things we can do. But that's what really changed things, because, prior to that, we interacted with computers via search engines and stuff like that, which were pretty darn good, pretty amazing, actually. I remember, in 1994, when the first browser came out, I was like, wow, this is like mind-boggling, right? To be able to say anything in English and something sensible comes back, right? And now we are here, where we're actually talking to it, and it's not just keywords and stuff. It actually seems to understand, and I sometimes say quote unquote understand, but I'll just drop the quotes here now, even if people think I'm being sort of anthropomorphic. It's undeniable that the machine seems to understand what you tell it, and if it comes back with something and you say, no, that's not quite what I meant this other thing, it actually says, oh, like, sorry, yeah, okay, I get it, right? And it comes back and sort of, you get the feeling that it's actually understanding the sequence of things that have happened. And I'm stressing sequence because you said something, it came back at you, you said something else, right? There's this whole dialogue that it's keeping track of, just like humans do, like in a conversation. And so that was, to me, a fundamental change in the technology, and things would never be the same again. Now, but as an insider, right? So that's one can look at that as an outsider and say, oh, it became accessible to everyone. But if I were to summarize the big deal as an insider of AI, I would say that the big deal is that for the first time, the distinction between expertise and common sense disappeared. And previously, that had been like a major distinction. When we thought of knowledge, we thought of, okay, knowledge is expertise, right? And, when I first got into AI in 1979, the emphasis was on capturing knowledge, which really meant expertise in specialized domains, like whether it was medicine or engineering, physics, whatever it is, there was expertise, it was identifiable. And people said, hey, we have expertise, let's like code it up and get the machine to really understand how to function in this specialized domain, and things will be hunky-dory, right? That we'll develop these specialized machines that have expertise. Well, that kind of worked for a while, but it broke down, right? Because in reality, there really is no distinction between expertise and common sense, right? Human beings just go in a really fluid way, in a seamless manner, between specialized knowledge and common sense, without even thinking about it, right? And in the old days, AI people said, well, let's forget about common sense for now. Let's like put that aside and let's focus on expertise, because common sense is just too hard, right? And by the way, bit of a tangent here, but I spent 6 months in 1988 at a think tank in Austin called MCC. This was the American fifth generation AI project. And there were two AI groups at MCC. One was called Reasoning Architectures. That was what I was part of. And there was another group called CYC, headed by an AI visionary called Doug Leonard. And that project, and it had 30, 40 people, right? Doug had a large team, and their goal was to teach computers knowledge, common sense knowledge. That was the goal, right? And I would say, and I hope I'm not being too harsh on Doug, that was a colossal flop, right? That is, I mean, I remember that, he had people who had business cards called knowledge enterer, right? And they were entering knowledge. And I remember talking to them, over a beer in the evening and saying, what do you guys do all day? And they said, oh, we enter knowledge into this system. And I was like, really? Like, what do you enter? They said, well, anything you can think of, right? So I said, what, you go into work and just enter common sense? They said, yeah. So, oh, what did you enter today? Well, today we talked about the fact that when you go to a restaurant, it's you're supposed to tip, right? That's common sense, right? And I was like, this just seems like such a thankless endeavor, right? And so AI just sort of, proceeded, there was sort of gradual progress, but this distinction stayed, right, between expertise and knowledge and common sense. And what ChatGPT did is it just broke that down. And to me, that is probably the most significant advance in modern AI, is that knowledge is knowledge, right? There is no distinction between expertise and common sense. It just sort of blends seamlessly. And that's been the biggest fundamental change, in my mind, in AI in the last 5 years.
Wow, that's a fascinating answer, and I'm going to have to take time and process that. And it seems to me that it actually feeds into the next big question I was going to kind of double click on, which is that, when I think of fields that I know reasonably well, like economics, for example, and it strikes me that over time, in the popular imagination, there are certain tropes that are commonplace and wrong. For example, in economics, people will often think of the world in, like, people outside the field will often think of the world in zero sum ways, because, of course, we are hardwired in hunter gatherer times to think of everything in zero sum ways. But we know that the way the world actually works is in positive sum ways, and all trades are, double thank you moments and so on. Equally, we are hardwired in prehistoric times to think of everything in top down terms, which, also leads to that engineering mindset where you think that you can design the world and design a society and so on and so forth. Whereas everything that is complex and beautiful in this world comes about in a bottom-up way through spontaneous order, whether it is natural selection or the evolution of languages or so on. And, uh, and these tropes are just there, and these tropes are just wrong. So in the context of I want to ask you, what are the standard tropes, what are the standard cliched impressions that people have about AI that are wrong? For example, the example that you just gave, the distinction between expertise and common sense, is something that even I would have assumed until recently. And most people will intuitively think that yes, there is that distinction, but what you're saying is that no, there isn't, it's wrong. What other examples can you think of this, like commonplace beliefs about AI that are actually not true? And equally, the flip side of the question, what deep truths are there about AI which are counterintuitive, just as, say, spontaneous order is in an economic context, that are counterintuitive and it took even you time to figure out, and the world doesn't know?
Wow, that's a big question. So let me see if I can unpack it and answer it directly. One of the reasons that I wrote the book, and I wrote the book for everyone, right? So this is not a book for AI experts or just for novices. I wrote it for everyone. And, one of my endorsers, Paul Shear, he put it well. He said, wow, this is like the first book that's sort of, part history of the field, AI manifesto, part sort of author's journey, et cetera. And that's what it is. So I wrote it for everyone because I felt that we were in a place where, I'm going to invoke a Bob Marley line, which is, if you know your history, then you'll know where I'm coming from. And I just felt like people didn't know their history, that people felt that there's this magical thing that's emerged, and wow, let's run with it. And so to most people, AI was something that's emerged in the last couple of years. And in fact, now AI has become a completely meaningless term, right? It means like nothing at all to me because people use it synonymously with technology. People say, "Oh yeah, well the AI will do it, right?" And yeah, give it to the AI, right? So now like everything's become AI to the point that it's completely meaningless. Right? It doesn't really mean anything. But what I realized was that regular people thought, "Oh, it's just something that's emerged in the last couple of years." And then I also realized that many of my younger colleagues in the field sort of thought that AI is synonymous with machine learning, right? Because before that, we had something called symbolic AI, and that was not worthwhile because that didn't go anywhere. So, right, and so it was like machine learning, and that's dangerous, when you have insiders in the field who actually don't appreciate the history and don't really understand the questions that people were asking in the 60s, the 70s, and the early 80s, and how those questions are still very relevant today. So when I got in the field in the late 70s, people in AI used words like reasoning, thinking, understanding, planning, right? Those were the words that we used to describe the programs we were writing, right? Does it really understand what you're saying? Oh, its reasoning is all messed up. Why does it think this when it should think that, right? So, and notice I said think this versus think that, right? Now, that might have been wishful thinking, right? Way back then, because we were anthropomorphizing machines to really sort of confer this thing about, oh, it's reasoning, whereas in fact it was just sort of manipulating symbols under the hood. But at least we were asking the right questions and thinking in terms of the right things. Now, interestingly, that whole AI paradigm, which I talk about in my book as the expert systems paradigm, because we used to focus on extracting expert knowledge and representing it, it sort of ran into a bottleneck, right? Which is what I call the knowledge engineering bottleneck, which is that it's too hard to like put this knowledge into the machine. We know more than we can articulate, which is something that Michael Polanyi said very eloquently. So there's like it's just too complex. And at that time, data had started becoming available. Suddenly data was emerging and people realized that, oh, you could actually learn from data, right? So my first, exposure to AI was in medicine, right? That's when I got into the field, like looking at this dialogue between a physician and a system called internist. And then, fast forward 15 years from then, I brought machine learning to Wall Street, right? That was like the early to mid 90s. And with that paradigm shift, our emphasis changed to prediction. Right? Suddenly, we said, "Well, forget about reasoning, thinking, all that. That's just like it's we've made some progress, but it's too hard, right? Especially because we can't get our heads around around common sense, and it seems to be pesky, right? It just pervades everything. And so let's forget about reasoning for a while and understanding and stuff. Let's focus on prediction because we can do that well from data, right? So these machine learning models emerged. And that's what I was doing on Wall Street as well, like predicting markets or predicting, customer behavior and stuff from data. And that was, relatively low-hanging fruit. You could now, the field advanced, right? So machine learning came into the picture. And that was the state of the art for the next, 25, 30 years, right? That is, it was the singular emphasis on prediction, prediction, prediction. Now, we'll come back to this because that turned out to be a very fortuitous diversion. Well, I shouldn't say diversion, just a fortuitous direction. But then, as we started this conversation, ChatGPT happened, right? And suddenly people said, "Oh, like we're back to, where we were. Let's revisit this whole thinking stuff here because now the machine really seems to, quote unquote, understand, quote unquote, the meaning of what we're saying, right?" And that was like a huge deal, right? That we're now talking to a machine that understands and can tell what we're talking about. It understands what we mean when we tell it something. The belief in the AI community was that, hey, there's this distinction, right? And then there were like other beliefs also in statistics, which bled into AI that had to do with, what makes a model robust, and statisticians have this assumption, a very reasonable one, that if you want to learn something, you should have lots and lots and lots of data, like, to learn from. And the general sort of, thinking is that, if you think of a datum having features, I'm getting a little technical, but, let's go with it. It has features, let's call them X1 to X1000, then you should have at least 1,000 examples to learn something reasonable from that. And not just 1,000, you should have 50,000, let's say, or 100,000, right? Because you've got like 1,000 variables, then you must have many more observations than the number of variables that you have, right? What was the thinking in statistics, still is to a large part, and in quantitative kind of modeling. And what my friend and colleague Jan LeCun showed was that, hey, you can actually have fewer examples than the number of variables that describe the data. And people said, like, what? Like, that makes no sense. And he said, sure, it makes sense, and I'll actually show you that it makes sense via a demonstration, right? And he built the first handwriting recognition system. But people were slow to accept this observation that sort of flew in the face of conventional wisdom, that you could actually learn from like fewer examples than the number of variables that we used to describe the data. And so that was another sort of firmly entrenched piece of folklore in the community that, got that was questioned, and now people are much more willing to say, maybe it's not so bad to have, more variables than the data. And what I've tried to avoid in this discussion, by the way, but I'll introduce this term, is this notion of complexity, right? So the idea was that if a model becomes too complex, that's bad. Simple models are good, right? So you refer to economics, right? One of the sort of, I don't know what the term for it is, but one of the things that I don't like about economics is that it assumes the world is linear, and it assumes that models are simple, that less is more or more is less, or whatever. Like, these are like very simple kinds of ideas. The more of something there is, the price goes down. The less of something there is, the price goes up. Like, common sense kind of things. They make intuitive sense. By the same token, the discipline actually made people think that simplicity was good. Simple models are good. Whereas the dirty little secret about AI is that, you know what? It's just the opposite. That complexity is actually great, right? And the way to think about this is complexity reflects the capacity of something to learn, right? If you've got the brain of an amoeba, there's only so much you're going to be able to learn, right? Because there's not that much complexity there. But as you start making the brain more complex, as when you start making the model more complex, it's not just complexity is bad and it will overfit to the data and stuff like that. The magic of AI, which sort of flew in the face of conventional wisdom, was that complexity is actually good. That you need it because the world is complex. Human beings are complex. Our thinking is complex. We are full of contradictions, right? We are not logical beings, right? We're illogical, sometimes illogical. We are really rich and complex. And to think that you can reduce intelligence to something simple, that's misleading. And so that's been one of the other sort of fundamental revelations in the last few years, is that complexity is actually a good thing. And the more complex you make these models, the better they seem to perform, right? As long as you have lots and lots of data to train them with. And where I see this going in the next few years is that machines will now start interacting with the real world. There's talk now that, we're running out of training data, right? That machines have already trained on everything out there that was possible, and they're running out of training data, right? I mean, I don't think so. I think this is just the early innings that we're in, right? Yeah, we've gobbled up a lot of the textual data, but hey, human beings don't learn just by reading, right? We learn from walking around, from interacting with the real world, by talking to people, right? So interaction leads to learning, and AI is now beginning to interact, right? It's beginning to interact with the real world. And when it starts moving around and becomes mobile, there'll be even more training data. By the way, the other day, a journalist asked me, he says, what do you think of these new glasses by Amazon, that were introduced a few days ago, right? They announced that drivers can now drive around with these new glasses and they'll be able to drive better and all that kind of stuff. And I was like, oh, this is so freaking brilliant, right? That this is sort of the evil brilliance of Silicon Valley, that this is actually like a precursor to mobile AI, because mobile AI is going to take a few years to develop. But hey, humans are already mobile. We're actually walking around, interacting with the real world. So why not just get humans to simulate and create more training data for the AI, right? So that's sort of the next wave of training data I see, coming into AI that'll make it even smarter and more knowledgeable about the world.
I want to ask another tangential sort of meta question before we proceed, because, at one point you said, quote unquote, understand. And I was thinking about the role that language plays in understanding any new field and even in shaping any new field. For example, in biology, there's a lot of a use of metaphor. And if one is not careful, a lay person can misunderstand that, right from Richard Dawkins talking about the selfish gene. And obviously genes aren't selfish or unselfish or whatever, it's just a metaphor. Similarly, you'll have a lot of talk of messenger genes and master genes and slave genes and so on and so forth. And there's a lot of use of metaphor. Sometimes it almost appears that you're anthropomorphizing, that particular field. Another danger you kind of warned against. But the point is, we have the language that we do. Language is deeply limited. Wittgenstein made the point that our understanding of the world is limited by the limitations of language. So what do you do? And similarly, it seems that in AI, that there is that limitation of language, which is why you were saying, quote unquote, understand. And in so many things, like using a term like cognition or using a term like reasoning, as you mentioned, was also being done in the early days and in fact ever sense, or even using a word like using a term like training data, which we wouldn't use for humans. And it seems to me that there are two dangers here. One is a danger that the common person like me can misunderstand certain aspects of what's going on, because we are thinking of language in the everyday sense, whereas it actually applies specific meanings within a field. And the other danger is that even people within a field may look more in one direction than another, because the language biases them in that way. So what can you tell me about this? I mean, you know all of the language, you've seen the evolution over the last 50 years, you've seen, the field evolve. So how do you think about the language and the ways in which it is inadequate?
Wow, you're asking me these like really packed questions, Amit.
You are the person to ask. So.
Yeah, I can answer this question in a number of ways, right? So language evolves, right? I mean, when people say sick now, it means like awesome, and whereas so that was a term that I guess came in like or a word that whose meaning got extended, right? And that kind of stuff happens all the time, right? So language is fluid, it's evolving. You know, we um, we sort of agree on what things mean. And this reminds me of my podcast with Anil Seth, which was just like fascinating about talking about consciousness, and I like his definition of consciousness, which is it is hallucinations that we agree on, which is brilliant, right? So his metaphor is that the brain is a prediction machine, right? It's always making prediction about what comes next, whether the scene we're seeing makes sense and what's going to come next and so on. And his theory is that when we all agree, so the brain's sort of hallucinating constantly, it's creating stuff. And when we all agree on our hallucinations, that's reality, right? According to him. Right? So I thought that was like brilliant. And that's sort of the role that language plays, right? It lets us sort of function and say, we mean sort of more or less this thing. We have a label that applies, to a whole bunch of things. Like a car is something that transports people. But, if you've done Lisp programming, cars actually stands for the contents of the address register. So language is fluid, it evolves, but it's approximate. It's a first approximation to, how we express reality. Now, I got into the area of smell 5 years ago through one of my PhD students at the Center for Data Science. And the reason I'm talking about smell is because this is an area where I've had a lot of discussions with my smell colleagues about language, right? Does language describe smell? And I would say, like, very crudely, like you smell something and how do you describe it? It's really hard. And I've tried, by the way, I've tried to smell lots of things and say, how would I describe them? And now, if I'm drinking wine and I'm like, getting a whiff of like what it smells like, and an expert says, "Oh, do you smell the blueberries?" And I'm like, now that I think about it, yeah, I smell them, but it wasn't actually blueberries. It was something else that I was smelling. I just couldn't describe it, right? So that's an area where language is again very, very crude. We might be able to say that lemon is closer to orange than to a pizza. That's useful, but it doesn't really tell us sort of the intrinsic feeling you get from smelling a lemon, right? It just doesn't describe that. So, you know, uh, my approach has been to say, you know what, we can't really. I'm not going to describe language, smell in terms of language. I'm going to describe it in terms of biology, which is observing how a mouse's brain responds to something it smells. And to me, that is truth, right? So I say, okay, that's the truth associated with this odorant, is the neural response of a mouse or a dog or a human, but it's just that we can't observe dogs and humans as easily. So that response is actually the truth associated with the odorant in terms of its response. And now, my vision is we'll build a database like this of lots of odorants described in terms of the molecular structure and the neural response they evoke in biology. And, hopefully we can learn something from this kind of data. So I've gone a little afield maybe of the intention of your question, but, I guess if I were to summarize it, I'd say language is a crude approximation. It doesn't constitute, sort of immutable truth, in any fundamental sense, right? You say, well, that object is green. Well, okay, that's your opinion. Do we all agree on it? Yeah, more or less green. It works for us, but it isn't sort of the one truth, of the thing we're observing. The truth is actually different. It's not really completely describable in terms of language, right? So I guess that's the way I would describe it, is it's not completely describable in terms of language. So language is just very incomplete, and more incomplete for some things than for others. Like for smell, I'd say is very incomplete, right? For vision, it's better because we all agree on what we're seeing. Smell is different. Touch is probably quite more subjective as well. Like when we touch something, how we describe it is also probably very subjective. So some areas language really works well, some areas less so.
I love the definition of consciousness as a hallucination we all agree on. And you spoke about sight. Now the thing is, obviously everything we see at any given moment is partly a hallucination, because our eyes are only focusing in high definition at a particular part of what we are looking at, and the rest is constructed by the brain. So we imagine we are seeing everything in front of our eyes, but we're actually seeing very little. And we sense this most acutely when we drive, because we have to learn to be conscious of the blind spot, that there is something that we simply can't perceive, though we appear to perceive it, and therefore we've got to be careful about that. And in that sense, are there blind spots with how language has perceived AI through the years? Because all of these terms that we use when we talk about AI, whether it's reasoning or cognition or training data and all of that, all of those are, as you put it, crude approximations. And crude approximations can also be, they can be limiting, they can set you down the wrong paths, and they can fundamentally be wrong, because you could be missing something really fundamental if you've used a term that is too inadequate to describe it because you didn't understand it well in the first place. So, what is your kind of sense of that within this field in the context of AI?
When you were talking, it reminded me of a book by Steven Pinker. I think it's called How the Mind Works.
Yeah.
The reason I was reminded of that is because his one of his major points in that book is that the brain actually works in a way that is useful. And, and this is another conversation I had with Tony Zador, who's a neuroscientist, an evolutionary biologist, that it's actually configured, our brains are configured to be useful, and useful meant historically survival. So our senses and our brains, that's what they're wired for, is survival. And I remember, reading that book by Pinker, and he says, for example, if you're looking at something and you turn your head 90 degrees to the left, the world changes accordingly, right? So it stays straight, because that's what's useful to the brain. It's not useful to the brain to see the world, at a 90-degree angle. It just can't make sense of it, right? It's too confusing. And so it does that automatically, right? And that's what the brain is doing, right? It's configured to do all kinds of things automatically, and we just don't understand those things, right? In fact, one of the sort of philosophical questions in AI is whether intelligence is sub-symbolic. That intelligence isn't about symbols. It's about something more fundamental than symbols, and that symbols come later. They're useful, we create them, but I'm not sure what kind of symbols my dog is thinking about when when they're looking at dog food or a ball or something like that. It's like, I'm not sure, like that, biology, that the intelligence we see in the biological world is symbolic, right? Maybe it's just sub-symbolic, and maybe our brains are also, processing information, but it's not symbols. That symbols are just something that come at the end for us to communicate with each other so that we can sort of function and agree on reality, right? So that's how I think about language. I'm not sure I answered your question, but it's there. It's very useful, but it looks like there's a lot of other stuff going on under the hood that we just don't understand. That has nothing to do with language.
So I want to now talk about, I won't take you through your personal journey because our previous episode did all of that, and I'll refer listeners to listen to that and think of this conversation as a part two to that. But I do want to ask you about the journey to the book. And before that, the journey of the podcast, because you began you began Brave New World by thinking about the world our future selves would like to inhabit, as you put it, and in this conversation already in the half an hour we've been speaking so far, you've referred to a whole bunch of previous episodes. So take me through that journey of being a podcaster with Brave New World. That what did you think it would be? What were you learning about the podcast as you went through it? And because to me, it's not just a series of discrete conversations, but it's an intellectual journey that you're on. And being with you for a lot of this journey, listening to a lot of these conversations in real time as they took place, I noticed also how your thinking is evolving, the questions that keep coming back to you, and how those questions themselves evolve with time as the world changes. So take me through some of that journey, that how critical was the Brave New World and the conversations that you had in shaping the way you thought and in your beliefs per se.
So I'll remind you of a conversation you and I had 2 years ago at a conference in Kerala. Where where you said, look, if you write a book on AI, I probably wouldn't read it, but if you write your journey through AI and your story, I would, because I think you've had a fascinating journey through AI. I'll never forget that. And that's why I wrote the book the way I did, right? Because I had actually been thinking of writing a book in 2018. I had an agent, I had a proposal, I'd written a proposal, I had an agent lined up, I was all set to write. But something didn't feel right. And I was actually going to write a book on trust, because I'd been thinking about, when do you trust AI for a long time, ever since I, started my hedge fund, and I was, using an algorithm to manage money. And one of the fundamental questions it raised for me is like, why was I willing to trust an algorithm, right? And so that's what my book was going to be about. And I sort of thought about it, and I said, no, that's just, like a few thousand people will read it, people interested in that particular topic. It's just way too specialized. And I just wanted to think about AI more broadly and its impacts on society, more broadly. And at that point, I felt like I was not ready to write that book, right? I mean, I could have written the book that I was capable of writing, but I felt like, that wasn't going to be of interest to humanity in general, that I actually wanted to write something much more general and accessible. But I didn't know what that was at that time, but I knew that that's what I wanted to do, right? So we're talking like 2019. So I passed on that, on that initiative. I was all set to start writing. And I remember talking to someone who said, I think you'd be a good podcaster. And I said, well, why do you think that? And they said, well, because you have a ability to make complex subjects understandable, and you've been a professor for a long time. That's what you do for a living. That is your gift, that you can do that. You can make something complex understandable. And that's when sort of light bulbs went off in my head. And I said, like AI is complex, right? It's not simple to understand. Like it's been evolving for 60 years, and I've lived through, over 40 of those 60 years. So I've been in it, and I've sort of seen the complexity, of the field and the various, phases it's gone through. So that's interesting. But then I thought more broadly. I said, it shouldn't just be about AI. It really should be more broadly about technology. And, at that time, COVID had happened. And, I was talking to my brother one day, and we're both big Isaac Asimov fans. And he said, oh, the COVID reminds me of, I said, oh, yeah, The Naked Sun by Asimov. He says, yeah, exactly, right? Because in that book, there's this Earth colony in outer space, and they're germaphobes, and they live a virtual existence, and just what we were doing during COVID, right? Just they don't like make physical contact, and when they do, they keep a distance of, guess what, 6 feet. So there was something that there was a larger force sort of guiding me in that direction, saying, this just seems like there's the world has that COVID has changed the world, right? That this will be a discontinuity that we'll remember. And COVID, in fact, was a pretty significant discontinuity. The world changed. People became used to interacting like we are now, right? People have now gotten used to working from home. In fact, they get pissed off when they're asked to, head to work, right? Which actually blows my mind, right? I'm paying you for something, but you don't want to come to work because what the hell? I can do it from home, right? So norms changed during COVID, and I thought that was significant. Like norms had changed, right? And so to me, the timing was right for Brave New World in the sense that, AI had evolved, even though we didn't have, ChatGPT then, but we had transformers, and the basis for ChatGPT existed. That these technologies existed, and I had been working with them for a few years already with transformers and vision and stuff like that. So I was familiar enough with the technology under the hood, and so that's what really made me think that don't write the book, right? That is, it's too early. It'll be too specialized. It's not right. You really need to sort of broaden yourself, broaden your thinking, talk to, luminaries in AI and related kinds of fields, and just sort of broaden your perspective, was my thinking at that time. And so that's what I did. So I put the book project on hold. I said, that's not, I'm not doing that. And I really started focusing on the podcast. So that was the beginning of the podcast during the COVID days.
And as the podcast happened, I mean, you just spoke to so many fine thinkers during the course of this, that I feel just taking a few names does the service to the rest. But I remember personally being blown away by so many episodes, like with Eric Topol, Daniel Kahneman, Jan LeCun. You spoke to all of these guys. There's just so many great episodes that expanded my mind. In what ways did your mind expand through this process? Like, what are the questions that you had which were unanswered, and gradually how did your thinking get sharper and sharper through the course of the journey? Can you remember any significant TILs which changed the way that you look at the world or the field?
So many things, Amit, changed, but I would, like, if I were to sort of describe those changes in one sentence, I would say that they just broadened my mind and made it much more interdisciplinary, right? Because I started talking to, you referred to some of these people like Eric Topol, who's a cardiac surgeon by training, like got into AI and deep learning. Kahneman, who is needs no introduction, and by the way, the conversation with Kahneman was fascinating, and I had lunch with him afterwards, after the conversation, where I asked him, why he had written the book, and he told me that he wrote the book because he was surprised at the extent of the variance, the variability in human judgment, right? That, he'd been studying human judgment for a long time. But, and he had a sense of like, what the variability would be, and he did this work in an insurance company where he actually asked senior managers what they expected to see in terms of, how much variance there'd be in terms of underwriters who had the same exact case and how they would price it, right? And he said it was 5 times larger than they had anticipated. And you asked me, like, what kinds of things have you learned? And the answer is like too many, but I'll give you one nugget from that conversation. I was having lunch with Danny in Italy. We went afterwards, and I asked him, like, why'd you write the book? And he told me the story about how he was surprised at the variance in judgment as to why it was like so much larger than what he had imagined. And then he said, and then I looked at it in other areas like the justice system and other areas of life, and I realized that this is such a universal phenomenon, right? This degree of variability in among humans. And I asked him, like, why do you think that is? Like, why is this variability? And I'll never forget what he said. And he said, we just look at the world differently. Everyone just looks at the world differently. And this reminds me of, like, hallucinations, things we can agree on. We agree, but we still don't. We still see things like so differently. Right? And the example he gave me was, he said, if I give, 10 judges, 10 crimes to rank by severity, he said they wouldn't even agree on the ranking. They wouldn't agree on the ranking, right? That's how much, difference there is fundamentally. That is, we are shaped, we don't appreciate enough the kind of biases that we have in ourselves, right? That are so deep and implicit, because those biases are useful. They help us function in life. They make things a lot easier, but they're so fundamental that we don't realize when they get in the way, because they've always been there. They've always worked for us, that we're not even aware when they don't work for us, right? And so, so that was like one of those fundamental insights, right? And if you think of it, like, oh yeah, we all see things in a different way, but he actually quantified it, and then he was talking about it sort of more from a philosophical angle as to why it is that we see the world so differently, right? And we all have such unique experiences, right? I mean, we are all, sample sizes of one, really, right? And when we do science, when we do social science, the reason these theories work so badly is because we're all just so different, right? Someone says that in physics you have, 3 theories that explain 99% of the phenomena, whereas in sociology you have 99 theories that explain 3%, right? It's just like, there's just so much complexity and richness and variability to humans, right? That's what we are. We're all one of a kind, right? There's just nothing in common between the two of us, right? And we forget that so often, okay? We just assume that people must see the world the way we do, and they don't.
Whenever I encounter AI skeptics, one of the things I realize that they are doing is not only are they underestimating artificial intelligence, but they're also overestimating human intelligence. And that's the sort of tangential question I want to ask you about. That what have you learned about human intelligence in all of this time researching and thinking about artificial intelligence? Because, people used to dismissively refer to, ChatGPT as just, oh, it's just autocomplete on steroids. And I'm like, wait a minute, the human brain is autocomplete on steroids. From much smaller LLMs with much less cognitive capacity, we are always doing autocomplete. Practically everything we say is a cliche of some sort. Even the miraculous things that our brain does, like construct an entire moving image out of the fragments that we get, is a kind of autocomplete on steroids. So what I want to ask you is that, fine, in one direction, AI has been proceeding and you've learned so much about it. What have you learned about us? What have you learned about the human brain, human cognition, human reasoning?
Yeah, great question. So, what comes to mind is my conversation with Phil Tetlock and his book. I think it's called Superforecasters or Superforecasting.
Super forecasting.
Superforecasting, right? So, the thing so Tetlock changed my mind about something in a fundamental way. So, I had a sort of generally dim opinion of humans. That is, I felt that we sort of, overestimate our capability and our brilliance and all that kind of stuff. I'm not knocking it. Like, human beings can be incredibly brilliant, a few, but for the most part, it's when I was on Wall Street, there were all these experts who had all these theories and opinions, but they were just opinions, right? And I realized that when I went to Wall Street, there were like lots of these theories of people as well. Obviously, when this happens, and I'd say, really, like the data doesn't show it, right? And so people have opinions, and people overestimate themselves, right, and make themselves out to be what they're not. But what I realized with in reading Tetlock's work is that there is something very special for in certain humans who are trained in a certain way, or rather who train themselves to think in a certain way, and that's what Tetlock calls superforecasters. And he's explained it brilliantly in his book. I mean, I can't do it justice, but just to give you a simple example, right? He'd say, what do you, if I, actually, I'll give you a real example, right? From my class from last year. Like, a bunch of students asked me, so, Prof, like, what do you think the chances are of a recession next year? And being the person that I am, I said, wow, great question. And I had no idea what the answer was. But I did have the presence of mind to turn it around and say, so what do you think, is the answer to that question? I'm curious, right? Because great question. I don't know. What do you think, right? And this is a class of like MBA students, right? And they say, well, the latest inflation data shows blah, like the Fed seems like they're tightening rates. They're concerned about inflation, all kinds of things, right? That you would expect from a business student. And this went on for like 10 minutes. And I said, I was reading this book by Tetlock. And if you ask one of Tetlock's super forecasters the same question, you know what their response would be? The response would be, so one of the things that Tetlock's points to, and actually so does Kahneman, is that these super forecasters, they begin by taking, quote unquote, an outsider's view or an outside view of the problem. They don't dive into the problem right away. They approach it as an outsider, right? And by the way, CEOs are great at this kind of stuff, right? CEOs have this ability to ask these, innocuous questions that turn out to be really deep, because they're taking what I'll call the outside view. They're not getting into the details, that the specialists are presenting to them, right? So the outside view would be, how many recessions have there been in the last 100 years, right? And that establishes what, is called the base rate. What's the base rate of suggestions, of recessions? And one of my colleagues, Aswad Damodaran, who was also a guest of mine, and actually now with some of my colleagues, I built a bot that, quote unquote, thinks like him, right? I also view Damodaran as a super forecaster, because this is how he approaches valuation, right? He says, well, what do you think margins are going to be in this industry? Well, let's look at the average of the margins in the industry, right? And begin with that. It's sort of an outside view. And then you can take the inside view and start getting into the details of a domain. But this human ability to sort of, without knowing anything, to actually ask the right question so that you sort of are grounded in the right place, right? That's like, an inherently sort of human ability. And some people are very good at that because they train themselves to be good at that. How do they train themselves? Well, they train themselves to be curious, that they're never satisfied with the answer to a question, right? It's always like, okay, I get it, but there's got to be something more going on here, right? There's this constant curiosity and asking questions and revising beliefs, when information becomes available, right? It reminds me of this famous Keynesian quote, right? That, when I get new data, I change my mind. What do you do, sir? Right? And so Tetlock's work made me think of humans and human thinking and reasoning in a new way. And that there are some people who really train themselves to be really good at, coming up with sort of an intuition as to where the answer should be ballpark, right? They kind of have that intuition because they're well grounded, and then they can converge on answers really quickly, which makes them really good at forecasting as well. So if I were to say that there's this one takeaway that I got from looking at that work, it's that there's this very wide variance in human ability. Very wide variance in human ability. And one of the questions that I have for the future is, what does this imply for, the future of humanity? And, my thinking is that we are at the beginning of an impending bifurcation of humanity into people who are superhuman, like in the spirit of Tetlock's super forecasters, and those who use AI as a crutch, use technology as a crutch, stop thinking, stop exercising the mental muscle, and essentially become functionally unemployable, and therefore are prime candidates for something like UBI, right? And one of the questions I try and address in my book is, how do you really try and stay on the right side of this divide? Because this is coming. My my book publisher, during a conversation we were having last year, asked me this question, like, do you think we're going to see another Einstein in the future? And I said, very likely, and that we're likely to see many more in the future, because these human beings will have access to an amazing technology, to an amazing knowledge base that we never had access to. I mean, I grew up, I went to school in a Tonga, right? A horse-drawn cart for Western listeners. And there was no technology then, right? And so we had to go to libraries physically and scour the few books there were. Now you've got, the wisdom of humanity, available on the internet, and my last guest, by the way, my next episode, it releases with Deepak Chopra, and he talks about how, like, the wisdom of the ages is now available to human beings, right? Which, by the way, I want to distinguish from emotional chatbots and companions and stuff like that, right? That's a very dangerous slope to go down, and we can talk about that. But Deepak's larger point is that we now have access to wisdom, like centuries of wisdom, that ChatGPT actually has that. And if you know how to ask it, it'll tell you. To me, people who are now being born, who are native AI people, just who are born with this machine around them, like, which will become the teacher of the future, I think, right? I think the teacher of the future will be AI, not humans. But humans will still have the curiosity, they'll still have the drive to learn, to push boundaries. And to me, those humans will become, in the spirit of Tetlock, become superhuman because they have access to this amazing technology that we haven't had so far. So I see like this variance in human beings widening even further with AI.
Lots to double click on. My original question was, by the way, about the what we've learned about the human brain in terms of its limitations and so on. And what you've pointed to is, super forecasting, by the way, is a masterpiece. I absolutely love the book. And what you've pointed to is the outliers, who actually possibly understand the limitations of human beings better than others, and bring the appropriate approach to tackling the world, which is A, an attitude of humility, and B, a process of Bayesian updation all the time, and which are limitations that don't actually exist for AI, because AI has no ego, and AI can do unlimited Bayesian updation because cognitive capacity and energy is not an issue for it. But just to go back to the original question before I double click on some aspects of what you just said, that what have you actually learned about the human brain through all of this? Because a lot of the criticisms about AI almost seem to treat the human brain as something mystical. Like a friend of mine who argues against AI, and I remembered this because you mentioned Einstein, says that AI will never be able to, do what Einstein did, which I, don't believe is true. But so what is your sense of that? What have we learned about the human brain in all this time of learning about AI?
By the way, let me say something about that second part, which is,
Mm-hmm.
oh, AI will never be able to do blah. That's been a constant, right? That never changes.
Mm-hmm.
That people in the 70s, Hubert Dreyfus, famous philosopher from Berkeley, said, I mean, computers can't be intelligent, like they have no common sense, right? A computer will never drive a car, right? It's something that's so easy and fundamental for human beings, right? So computers never be able to do that. And that goalpost keeps moving, right? As you achieve something, then AI becomes something that hasn't been achieved yet. So that criticism, oh, it'll never be able to do things, that tends to be transient. Your other question about what we've learned about the brain is much harder to answer, because there you're really getting into sort of the innards of neuroscience, and that's not it's not a field that I really keep on top of, like in terms of like understanding let's say the nature of the synaptic connection, and and how the fundamental questions as to how we generate meaning from information that we're receiving remains unsolved, right? So even something as fundamental as that, the answer is we just don't know, right? So for as far as I'm concerned, we actually know very little about sort of how the brain really does its magic. And that's just like, you know, to me, that's like a long ways off, right? Unless we can actually get in there and start observing, all of the circuits, at the level where we can insert electrodes and stuff like that. That will remain mysterious. That is the physics of the brain, I think, is what you're getting at. It will, yeah, that's largely unknown and will remain mysterious for some time.
So let's get back to talking about the book. I love reading your book partly because it is a personal journey and it's written in this really accessible tone. And at the same time, I get a great sense not just of your journey through it, but also the journey of AI and how it's kind of growing. And I'll get to the specifics of that later. But first, I want to ask you about how knowledge coheres into wisdom. Like in your case, or in the case of anyone who's an expert in any field, you begin with a lot of knowledge and you gather a lot of that knowledge as you're young and the years go by and you gather more and more knowledge, and some of it starts forming into these broader views where you can step outside of yourself, like the CEOs do, as you mentioned, like the super forecasters do, where you can take a broader view and eventually you begin to crystallize a certain view of the world which comes from all the data points you've gathered about it. Tell me about how this has happened in your life, because I think the process in most lives is both very slow, slower than you would expect, and also invisible. And in your case, a lot of this would also have come not later in life, as you did the podcast and the book, and you wrote an earlier book in 1997 as well on a related but narrower subject. But you've been a teacher all of this time, you've been a professor all of this time, and that's also something that compels you to sort of crystallize the knowledge that is out there in a way that is communicable to people. And teaching is really the best aid to thinking, in a sense. So take me through that journey of your becoming a thinker and understanding the field and the role that teaching played in it, the role that writing played in it, and so on and so forth.
I guess what makes things clear is simple sort of generalizations, like, I'm actually amazed at how, you hear these, like someone's wise and they say something and you're like, wow, that is so cool, like, why didn't I think of it? I don't know, for some reason I'm reminded of this one by Satguru, which goes, you know, if heaven is so great, like, what are you waiting for? Leave. you know, it's like, that's brilliant, right? I mean, I wish I could have said it, right? And he's, with that statement, he's saying so much about religion, right? And especially certain types of religion, right? I mean, it's such a pithy statement, right? If heaven's like, so, like, what are you waiting for? Right? Go, right? And of course, what he's saying is, look, this is heaven, right? What you have around you is heaven. Appreciate it, right? Because it ain't going to get any better than this, right? You, you know, um, of course, that's one of the things he's saying, but there's plenty of other things. So to me, it's sort of these generalizations that one learns over time, especially teaching and writing, that have been useful to me. And what I've found to be useful, as over the years, I think I've become a better teacher. It's not been easy. It's not good. It's not easy to be a good teacher. It's really hard. And when I was younger, I struggled with it. But what's made it easier is the fact that I now find it very easy to read a room of people. That I can walk into a room of 50, 100 people and read it quite well. And especially when the conversation starts going. So you develop the ability to read it, and that just comes through experience. It's not something someone teaches you. You just sort of learn through generalization, and so you learn sort of you learn how to do that. So it's things like that, I would say, that have been useful, that I would say are, I guess, sources of wisdom. Now, I don't regard myself as a wise guy. I wish I had more pearls of wisdom, but I don't. I mean, I view myself as being a scientist. I keep trying to see connections between things. I've always been very interested in connections, between things, because that's another way to learn, is to, see how it relates to something else you know something about. So, seeking connections and generalizing have been, to me, two very useful tools to enable me to see the world a little more clearly.
I also want to double click into the process of writing this book. And in particular, I remember I was still producing Brave New World at one point in time, and you had an epiphany that caused you to reduce the cadence of Brave New World, turn it from a fortnightly into a monthly, and also to take your book really, really seriously. And that, of course, was a accident you had, where you had a car accident, and I remember you told me about it, that you thought you were going to die. For a fraction of a second, you thought this was it. And you spoke about how it changed you in fundamental ways. And people can say these things, but to anyone who knows you, it was obvious it did change you in fundamental ways, because the Brave New World was so dear to you, and you turned it into a monthly instead of a fortnightly. And then you, clattered out that book that, we met, that conference where we met at, which was 2 or 3 years ago. I forget exactly where. And this is an anecdote I'll tell the readers, that the conference organizers, this was at Kochi, the conference organizers told us all that, hey, we are going down on a cruise down the backwaters of Kerala. So Vasant and I and a whole bunch of people got onto this boat, and the boat never went anywhere because it was raining heavily. But Vasant and I and Lancelot Pinto, who's also been a guest on my show, were hanging around, and all of us were speaking about how we want to write books. And then the three of us made a pact that by the time this conference comes around next year, we would all have written our book. And I'm so happy and so proud that you did it. And Lance and I haven't quite done it, but we will. I have full faith in Lance, and I'm gonna get it done. And I'm so proud that you did it. But it's also interesting to me that one act kind of changed. So can you talk a little bit about that what changed? What did you realize about yourself and your life that you took these big decisions? What happened?
You know, the incident brought tremendous clarity to my life. It and it's too bad that sometimes things like that have to happen for you to get some clarity. But I did. It was because I thought for sure I was dead. It was a sixth of a second from recognition to impact. Old lady driving a car didn't see me coming. And as I've written about this, several times, people talk about, oh, humans have situational awareness, whereas computers don't, and that was a case that it was just reversed, where I felt that a driverless car would have had situational awareness, right, that the human didn't. But that incident, and by the way, when that impact happened, the windscreen, went opaque, blank, and the car kept lurching, and I thought I would get hit by something from the other side, and miraculously it came to stop on the side of the road. And by the way, a tidbit here: when I went to pick up the car 3 weeks later from the car pound, the windshield was perfect. There was
Wow.
no scratch on it. Right, so I don't know what the hell this is. This is like a new technology, but I've never seen that. It was miraculous.
Wow.
But it did bring clarity, and there were two things that it brought clarity to. One was, I said to myself, you really have to, close relationships in your life, you just have to make them as good as you possibly can, right? That's an effort you have to make every day, all the time. People important in your life, you really need to make that effort every day to make those relationships as perfect as possible, because you would have regretted leaving this world and leaving those relationships kind of, unfinished, right? So that was like clarity. And I've, and I have actually pursued that, right? So I've tried to do that. But the other thing was, I said, I really want to write my story about AI because I've been thinking about this for a long time. I feel like I have useful things to say. I feel like I can take this complex subject and make it understandable to everyone, and so that people can see the world in a new way and see their future in it in a new way, right? So I felt like I would have regretted not having, put that down and left that, as a legacy. So those are the two things that, I got clarity on. And that very week, I actually wrote my first two chapters.
Wow.
So it was like, because they'd been sort of brewing in my head, and I said, just write them, right? And so I did. And after that, it was pretty much me functioning as an LLM, because I did have an overall plan, right? But I had no idea what chapter 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 would look like when I wrote the first two chapters. I really didn't. I did have an overall, plan for the book, but, as, one of the U.S. Supreme Court justices said many years ago, I think it was like Sam Alito, who was writing his brief on something, and he said it just wasn't cooperating, that the writing wasn't cooperating with the concept, right? And so, as when you start writing, where you end up can be a little far afield of where you thought you were going to end up. And so that's kind of what happened, right? So I turned into an LLM, and I said, all right, just keep going. And that's what I did. And so, I'm happy to say that I just sort of put my head down, and for the next 8 months, I just tried to write something every day, and just sort of kept that momentum going. And I realized that something had to give. I was doing these podcasts fortnightly. They take a lot of effort. I prepare like crazy for each podcast. I tend to read everything the person's written. I tend to think about it a lot. I get, stressed out about it. So it takes up a lot of time. And then writing the newsletter that accompanies each podcast also is, it's time consuming and it takes work. I mean, people don't realize that writing a 1,500 word thing every week or every couple of weeks just takes a lot of effort, especially if you want it to be polished and good. So I realized that I couldn't do everything. Something had to give, and so I switched to a 1-month cadence, which I'm really pleased about, because it gave me breathing room. And of course, that it doesn't let up. As you well know, I mean, one of the reasons you haven't written yours is because your life doesn't let up. It's just one thing after another, right? And so, that doesn't let up, but at least it did let up for a few weeks in the month, and I was able to write the book. So that's the story.
Yeah, it's just madly inspiring. And so, thank you for doing that. Now, I don't have a reason not to do it myself. Tell me about the role that the newsletter played. Because, again, what I love about the newsletter also is that it's a combination of a personal tone, and at the same time, with the personal tone, you're not just talking about the episode that you might have released of your podcast, but also the subject, also the theme. What role does that play? Like, I often speak to writers in terms of this new framework I've thought of for myself, which is I've borrowed the economics terms of stock and flow, where stock is wealth and flow is income. And I use it in the creative arts, and I say that even writers have a stock and a flow. And a stock is something like your book that you put your crystallized knowledge into it, and it can be read 10, 20, 30 years later. Whereas a flow is something like a newsletter or a podcast episode that you bring it out regularly. It may or may not have value 30 years later, but it is useful because that is, the daily work that you put in, and that is your interface with the world, and everything's kind of happening in real time. And I just feel that for every creative person or for everyone in the knowledge economy, both are important. You need the flow because that is how you go to that mental gym regularly and you work out and you put your work out there. But you also need the stock because that is what future generations are going to look at. So how do you think about it? What role did the newsletter play in making the book happen or in sharpening your thinking and your style?
That's I love the metaphor, and it really resonates with me because you're right. I mean, the newsletter is a flow. It's it's ideas, and um, I don't know how you pick your subjects, but in my case, the structure of the newsletter is that I first describe my guest in the podcast and I summarize it in a few paragraphs. But of course, I don't give away the nuggets or the meat of it. But I do, provide a summary, and then the rest of it is really something that's current, that happens to be top of mind, that's interesting, and that keeps changing. And I don't, and that's completely unplanned and relatively spontaneous, right? I have no idea what my next one is going to be even right now, right? A few weeks from now, I have no idea what it's going to be, and it just depends. So, for example, when I was out on the West Coast, I teach this tech MBA class. And I remember when I did it a couple of years ago, I had done this case study on NVIDIA with the students. And we were talking about whether AI, is AI a general purpose technology? And what do we mean by general purpose technology? Well, things like electricity or the internet, things that are, technologies that have a pervasive impact, across all sectors of the economy. And, I remember I wrote this newsletter called, Is NVIDIA the New General Electric? You know, um, which I thought was kind of a really interesting idea because General Electric actually dominated the industry for 100 years, right? And so my question was, cycles have become faster. So how long will NVIDIA dominate for? I don't know, but I liked the metaphor. And so it was stuff that I had, talked about in class that, influenced that thinking. And ultimately, that did actually make it into my book in a different kind of way. In my book, there's a chapter where I talk about, I'm a big Seinfeld fan, and one of the wacky characters, Newman, there's this one episode where he tells Jerry, when you control the mail, you control information, and so, that newsletter actually made it into my book, in a more sort of compact and, crystallized form, where I'm talking about how the new sort of behemoths like Google and Nvidia and how they're basically now in charge, that they control information, so I call them the new Newmans. That's what I call these, behemoths. Um, but it's all, that's all flow. That's all flow, and some of it, makes it into the stock, into the book, and some of it is just sort of ideas, that were there, they were useful, but they're just sort of keeping things going, right? They're keeping the mental muscle sort of, in shape and just forcing you to think about, you know, things that are current, and making them accessible. Like that's always, to me, that's always the important thing, is to take something current that may not be obvious to people, may be complex, and just make it accessible.
Fascinating. And I think it's kind of, now that we've got into the writing of the book, I think it's time to talk about the book itself. But let's take a quick commercial break before we do that.
All right.
Long before I was a podcaster, I was a writer. In fact, chances are that many of you first heard of me because of my blog India Uncut, which was active between 2003 and 2009 and became somewhat popular at the time. I loved the freedom the form gave me, and I feel I was shaped by it in many ways. I exercised my writing muscle every day and was forced to think about many different things because I wrote about many different things. Well, that phase in my life ended for various reasons, and now it is time to revive it. Only now I'm doing it through a newsletter. I have started the India Uncut newsletter at indiauncut.substack.com, where I will write regularly about whatever catches my fancy. I'll write about some of the themes I cover in this podcast and about much else. So please do head on over to indiauncut.substack.com and subscribe. It is free. Once you sign up, each new installment that I write will land up in your email inbox. You don't need to go anywhere. So subscribe now for free. The India Uncut newsletter at indiauncut.substack.com. Thank you. Welcome back to The Seen and the Unseen. Vasant has shown infinite patience to still be here with us. Our first half was about as long as a Brave New World episode, and you think he'd be done because that's when we switch off. But no, he's still here and begging for more. And in fact, he just mentioned as we were about to start this recording that there's one thing he forgot to mention when I asked him that question about what he learned from his guests. So, and I immediately told him, shh, don't tell me now. We'll do it on the show. Wait for me to hit record. So, Vasant, go for it.
Yeah, it's hard to to summarize these things. Is just a few nuggets. But one of the things that I did learn from my guest Michael Roth, who is the president of Wesleyan University, is the purpose of higher education. Which is something I had never really thought about. Before I did that podcast, it was like, higher education is about learning, right? Just like to learn new stuff. And his response was, the purpose of higher education is to maximize serendipitous encounters. And the more I think about it, the more profound it, it is. It's, if you think about it, that's kind of what it's about, to be in the same place with other people, with other students, with professors. I mean, that's kind of what it's really all about, is maximizing the likelihood of serendipitous encounters, which also means like being open to them to begin with, right? You have to be open to it and seek it.
Yeah, I'd done an episode on my YouTube show, Everything is Everything, about this new phrase I had learned. It's the surface area of serendipity. And I guess universities maximize the surface area of serendipity more than anything else. And I remember, in fact, listening to Michael say that to you because, dear listeners, what I do is that, while Vasant is recording these on Squadcast, I'm also there, silent and invisible, the unseen to their seen, as it were, just kind of listening to everything. So, yeah, this struck me. And so before I proceed the way I plan to by talking about the book and about the history of AI, I'll take a question that comes tangentially out of this. Like, I think about education a lot, and I think that you've of course summed up you've quoted Michael on higher education as maximizing serendipity, and one could say they are also useful for things like credentialism and networking and all of that, but how much education is happening. And similarly, I think of what comes before higher education, which we won't call lower education, but it might as well be called that as well. And I think about how schools are not really about education. That whole system where kids of the same age study together, study the same subjects, etc., etc., etc. You test a monkey on how to climb a tree, but you also test a fish on how to climb a tree. Makes absolutely no sense. But the reason it's persisted is that the core function of schools is daycare. It's not education. And equally, the core function of higher education even if you were to call it maximizing serendipitous encounters or etc., or building networks or whatever, is also in a sense not education. And more through time, education happens in different ways. A lot of it comes from life, a lot of it can be self administered, etc., etc. What are your thoughts on how AI can actually change that? Like in the book, you actually do mention that something that boggles your mind is that teachers of the future will be AI and not human. So give me a sense of where you see this going, and if you are a 12-year-old boy 10 years later, or if you're born today, how are you going to learn about the world as the decades go by?
Yeah, I think that phrase about the serendipitous encounters is probably going to be even more valid,
Yeah.
going forward, right? In an era where the teacher is the AI. By the way, allow me a slight tangent,
Sure.
but in my, I did this TEDx talk in 2018 called When Do We Trust Machines? And I put up this heat map of, trust. And I put teachers, professors in the human zone. I was like, all right, I think I'm safe for now, right? That was 2018, right? And here we are, like 7 years later, and I feel like, no, I'm not safe anymore. That I think an AI could do a much better job than I can in several areas that I teach. And in fact, I find myself, relying more and more on my experience and my human side, in the classroom. So, I tend to teach 3-hour classes, and the first 45 minutes are a open-ended Q&A, right? You can ask me anything as long as it is even, as long as it's at least remotely connected to the material of the course, right? So I'm not going to, comment on current, American politics, but I will talk about it if you want to know how it might impact education. So the first 45 minutes tend to be, just Q&A, just free-form discussion. And I find myself relying a lot on my experience on Wall Street, my experience, with business leaders. And I find that students like that, they appreciate that, because they can get the math and the formulas and all of that stuff from anywhere, increasingly from AI. But what they can't get is that experience, that the AI hasn't actually been on Wall Street and done machine learning and managed people and dealt with personalities and, stuff like that, or seen connections. So I see that still being sort of the domain of humans, that sort of experiential part. But I think increasingly that's what, you know, um, humans will do is to sort of try and put things together and tell stories and, bring experience to the table, which is relevant for education as well. It's, stuff that you don't find in the textbook. In fact, allow me another second tangent. When Google first came out, when Google search came out, I remember we had a committee to discuss like how that changes education, right? And the thinking there was, if you can find it in Google, it has no place in the classroom, right? That is, don't spend time on it if you can like get the answer from Google, right? And that was Google, yeah. And now you've got this thing on steroids, for crying out loud, right? So now it's just like there isn't anything that you can't get from ChatGPT, right? You can get everything. So does that mean that you have no place in the classroom? That has, so what do you do in class, right? It's a great question, right? When you can get everything from ChatGPT, what do you do in the classroom?
So answer it.
Well, the answer is that you bring your human experience and make the connections, between things, and you arouse curiosity, right? And you get people to ask questions. And this is also one of the things I tell people is that, look, if you don't show up in class, you're not really participating, right? You're sort of in that old model of education, which is, oh, I'll listen to the lecture later, and get it. I'll just save myself the time. It's like, no, that doesn't work, because you're supposed to be here creating, being part of the lecture. You're supposed to be part of the cooking, right? Not just consuming what was cooked by some other people, and then saying, okay, I get it. No, you don't. You were supposed to be there. You were supposed to be part of it. You were supposed to be part of the cooking. So that's to me, that's the role of the human at the moment in the classroom, right? That the AI can't do. But it can do everything else.
Yeah, I mean, you're a great teacher. In fact, through osmosis, I've learned stuff from you, and I don't think I could have learned them any other way except through our personal interactions. But I think this human interaction bit and the way you describe you do your classes, I think the teachers who are capable of this or able to do this are really outliers. Like, I'm reading this really good book by Arthur Brooks on how to make the most of the second part of your life, and he talks about how there are two kinds of intelligence: fluid intelligence and crystallized intelligence. And fluid intelligence is what the young are so good at, that you pick up things fast and you're creative and etc etc. But fluid intelligence declines by a certain age. In some professions like music and math, it's pretty much in decline by the 30s. In others like history, it's in decline by the 50s. But his point is that don't lament that, because the second kind of intelligence, which is crystallized intelligence, begins to form late and goes on for all of your life. And according to him, that is why the best teachers are actually older, where you get 20, 30 years of experience, and then you can put your crystallized intelligence to use. And that's what helps you see the bigger pictures and draw more connections from all the dots that you've gathered. And that's what makes for the best teachers. And I just think that 95% of teachers, whether in schools or colleges, whether young or old, are probably just going through the motions and could easily be entirely replaced by AI. And it's only the 5% who, bring that value to the classroom. And before I ask you my next question, which is related but about students themselves, what's your thought on that?
I agree. I agree completely with that. That a lot of people go through the motions. It's also comfortable going through the motions, right? You know what's expected. You know what you're supposed to cover. It's easy to do, right? And so, there's a tendency to sort of fall into that. But that is just, less and less valuable. In 2014, I had a workshop at Stern. I organized with two of my colleagues, Arun Sundarajan and Adam Brandenberger. And John Sexton came and spoke about the future of higher education. I felt at that time that universities were under threat of disruption by MOOCs and online platforms. Remember, like MOOCs were like the real rage at that time, right?
Yeah.
And I felt that this was an impending disruption in higher education, right? And Clay Christensen came and talked about, the innovator's dilemma. We had, some of the CEOs of, Udemy, and there were a couple of these, emerging, online platforms, talking about how, higher education's expensive. Oh, by the way, it reminds me of Charlie Kirk as well, who did have a point about that, right? And all of that stuff, right? And I thought, this is trouble for universities, and nothing changed. Like didn't happen. Universities got even more entrenched. Stronger. And so I got that wrong. But as my I had this conversation with Raghu Sundaram, my ex-dean. He said, maybe you weren't wrong. Maybe you were just way too early. That maybe this is sometimes things take a lot longer than you anticipate to play out. He said, maybe this is an impending disruption, but that wasn't the time. But maybe there will be a time when it happens. And now that I think about it, I think that this could happen. And because there's this sort of existential question, lurking over professors, teachers, which is, how is this going to change the way you teach? How is it going to change the way you assess? It's just like a fundamental paradigm shift in the making, that's happening as we speak. And no one knows the answers, right? We're all trying to figure it out. But to me, the larger direction seems pretty clear, that the machine is just getting amazingly good at answering anything. I mean, the other day I was in a job talk. There was a statistician talking about some really abstruse topic, and he lost me at some point. And so I quickly, while he was talking, went to ChatGPT and I said, hey, like, what's the deal here? And it gave me an answer, right? During the talk, I didn't need to tune out, zone out. I got the answer, and then I followed the rest of the session, right? So to me, the writing is on the wall, right? That this is not a question of if, it's a question of when the machine becomes the primary teacher.
And in this sense, I actually agree that you were too early because the prediction seems to me to be sound. And in this sense, you were really, I guess, following in the footsteps of your great teacher, Herbert Simon. Like in your book, you spoke about how Herbert Simon made these two predictions in the 1960s. One is that AI will one day be the chess world champion, and the other is that middle management will eventually be made redundant by AI. And of course, and he said something like within 10 years, and obviously, or whatever, some time period, but obviously that fell into the classic trap of overestimating the short term and underestimating the long term. The chess took like till the late 1990s to happen, and eventually now, of course, it has happened, but it took 3-4 decades to happen, and middle management becoming redundant is a prediction that you could actually make today. It still hasn't completely taken place.
Yeah.
So well done on that. I just think that you were too early for the curve. There's another nice anecdote in your book which has to do with education, which I enjoyed, which is you speak about this class where, on a particular day, everybody, for all the kids, could not turn in their homework because ChatGPT was down the previous day. And I think about, whenever my writing students ask me about the impact of ChatGPT in their writing, should they use it for their writing, should they use it to help edit, I always say that, listen, use it as a tool and not as a crutch. Like with any new technology, it becomes super dangerous when people use it as a crutch. And if you use it as a tool, it's great. And a few minutes ago, you spoke about the bifurcation that you see. And we'll come to the impact on jobs and all of that later. But there is that fundamental bifurcation which has always been there in the human spirit, that whenever any technology comes about, uh, a lot of people will use that technology as a crutch, but some will use it as a tool and they will really get ahead. Like similar fears were voiced about what happened when writing came about, what happened when the printing press came about, what happened when the calculator came about. The calculator didn't make people worse at math. It was a fantastic tool for mathematicians to use, and it was a fantastic tool even for non-mathematicians, for the rest of the people, the lemmings or the sheep, as it were. And it didn't lead to job losses. It just led to more jobs for everybody because productivity went up so much and it helped us all so much. But that's a separate issue. Leaving the jobs aspect of it aside, what is your sense of how AI changes the ways in which people learn and the ways in which people think, and what are the ways in which you have increasingly used AI in the last 5 years? Like, what place does AI play in your specific workflow?
So before I answer that, I'm going to
Mm.
ask you a question.
Yeah.
Do you drive around,
Yes, of course.
and do you use GPS?
I
And
use
do you use
yeah,
like
yeah,
yeah? Do
yeah.
you ever drive without it?
I can drive without it, but I kind of prefer not to.
Okay, so do a few experiments on yourself, right? Try driving without it in areas where you would have driven without it previously,
Mm-hmm.
right? And see how well you do.
Hmm.
Because I because my sense is that it's making me dumber
Mm-hmm.
spatially. That using GPS and navigation apps are diminishing my spatial awareness and spatial thinking, right? Because the other day I was going to Poughkeepsie train station. I mean, I've driven there like a gazillion times, but I've gotten used to using the GPS, right? And then I said, "Yeah, screw it. I know the way." And I was lost. I could not believe it, that I was actually, and I had to turn the Google Maps back on to find the station. So my fear is that these things are like so good and they're so addictive that you actually stop exercising that muscle, right? I feel like exercising that muscle where you had to like think about, like, do I go left or right? Is it generally in that direction or that one, right? And then we used to find our way, right? As you go in the direction, you say, okay, yeah, it's that street. Right? You may not have had the complete plan in your head when you wanted to go from A to B, but you kind of smelled your way around, and usually, many of the times you actually chose the optimal route. Um, so my fear is that, and as you were talking earlier, is that we just stop exercising that muscle even without realizing it.
Yeah, that's a sort of a huge fear, but at the same time, I would say that, thinking off the top of my head, one argument for using GPS all the time would be that, hey, number one, even if you lose your sense of spatial awareness, it is not important in a world where you have GPS. And number two, it frees up your cognitive capacity to do other things while you're driving. Like you could listen to Brave New World by Vasant Dhar while you're driving, which otherwise you might not be able to focus on if you have to, get to wherever you're going and look at the streets carefully.
The only you're absolutely right, but the one thing I would point out is that very often exercising a muscle for a certain thing actually gives you an ability to do something else as well, right? So people say that, for example, musicians are inherently mathematicians as well, that they just don't know it, that they're like great at like seeing patterns implicitly, and they have that in their head, right? And so they do math and music are sort of related, my point is that spatial thinking may serve a larger purpose than just going from point A to B. And it's that complete package of, cognitive functions and abilities that I think, makes us sort of better at other things, right? The more you're good at, the more you'll be good at, kind of thing. It's a virtuous cycle. And that is my fear with AI, is that in many areas of our life, it's just so good that you become unaware that it is leading to, deterioration, that you're becoming dumber.
Fair enough. So, in your life, what do you use AI for that you didn't 5 years ago? What have you made a conscious decision to not use it for because you're worried it'll become a crutch and you'd rather think for yourself?
So it is so seductive, Amit, right? That uh, I find myself hardly using search anymore. I just go to ChatGPT pretty much for everything, right? So if I want, so I was writing a paper the other day, an article on this Damodaran bot, and I wanted to know, so I asked ChatGPT, I said, which were the most influential academic articles in factor modeling in the 80s and why? And boom, I got the answer in 2 minutes. And guess what? Now, the important thing is that it gives you the answer, but how do you know it's any good? Right? And this is what, ties to my earlier point about this bifurcation of humanity, right? The reason it was useful to me is because I was already familiar with the literature, So when it brought up these papers and the names, I said, oh, yeah, I remember that guy. Yeah, he used to do blah, blah, blah. Oh, yeah, and some of the papers I'd already seen and read before. I just didn't remember them. Some of them were new. Um, so I find it to be an incredibly powerful tool for doing knowledge work, right? For doing intellectual stuff that would have taken me days or weeks to do previously, where I have the answer in a minute. But the reason it's useful to me is because I can tell how good it is and how accurate it is, Whereas if, someone asked it without knowing the answer, how would they even know that?
And I guess in the same way, it's sort of the same thing. Like to go back to the calculator with a calculator, like if you give someone like me a scientific calculator, there's very little I can do with it because I don't know shit. I don't know math. It's not really useful to me. I can just do little tricks with it. But to someone who's in a particular field and who has great creative ideas and understands the lay of the land, it's an incredibly powerful tool. I mean, I find exactly the same thing that when, for example, I get GPT to do these deep research research reports where I think it's really outstanding. I find that what is truly important is that one, the prompt has to be great. And if I really know the subject well and do a detailed prompt with a lot of nuance and detail, the output will be like that. And two, even if it gives me a great report without a great prompt, I would not be able to make much of it unless I had a sense of the lay of the land already. So, in that sense, I completely agree with you that it absolutely depends on how much you bring to the table as well. But it can help you grow and do that also.
Yeah, but no, so to bring it back to where you started, so I dodged that question originally, right, about the homework, right? No homework was turned in because ChatGPT was down, right? I mean, like what the, like,
Yeah.
yeah, right, exactly. Like what kind of world is this where people are unable to complete a homework because ChatGPT is down? Like that's just absurd, right? I was giving a talk the other day. Last week, actually, I was in the World Trade Center, which is a real trip going back to the World Trade Center these days because I saw the two towers come down from my building,
Oh, wow.
in 2001. So it's quite a trip now to actually go up there. So I was giving a talk to a bunch of people, and the discussion turned to exactly this topic, about the education for kids. And I asked the audience there, it's like, how many of you have kids who are like, my kids are now in their 30s, right? But most of the audience there, their kids were anywhere between like 7 and 16, right? So they were at that age. And the parents were like really concerned, right? Like, how should we think about this, right? And the question I asked them was, do you think it's making your child smarter or dumber? Yeah. And they said, well, we can't tell. I said, you've got to be able to tell, right? As a parent, that is your responsibility. Is this, well, how do we do it? I said, I don't know. Like that is very family specific and very specific to, how you function with your kids and the atmosphere at home and stuff like that. But you've got to have a way to figure this out. Is it making them smarter or is it making them dumber, right? So to me, that is the fundamental question because it's there. And they said, well, for example, what would be a case where it becomes smarter? So, like if I were to do an experiment, I'd know they've become smarter if they can actually still do the exercise or whatever they're trying to do without the tool. And it's no worse than they would if they were using the tool, right? I mean, to me, that's a great test to see, if someone's getting smarter or dumber, right? If they can't do it, then hey, chances are they're getting dumber. They're using it as a crutch, right? So for parents these days, it's incredibly important, right? When with kids growing up like native, with AI around them, I mean, I'm glad I'm not a parent at the moment, right? Because to me, this is like a really fundamental question, confronting parents is how is AI impacting my kids?
Let's start talking about the history of AI. And one of the things I loved in your book was that it brought together frameworks and your personal experience. Like something that I'd like you to talk about a bit now, which you've described so well in your book, is you've spoken about the four different AI paradigms. How you begin with expert systems and then machine learning and then deep learning, and now we are arriving at general intelligence. What are the constraints and bottlenecks that lead to each of these evolutions? And what is pretty spectacular is that you have personal stories around each of these shifts because, right from the late 1970s, your early encounters with the internist, which you described in your previous episode with me, when you saw, Jack Myers ask all the questions it did and got the output, and that was an expert system. And then later you go to machine learning in the 90s when, you do that little experiment for AC Nielsen, and then you work at Morgan Stanley and then start your own machine learning hedge fund, all the way to deep learning, all the way to general intelligence. So tell me a bit about what is specific to each of these paradigms, why these shifts happened. Give me a sense of the lay of that land.
So the fundamental problem of AI has not changed, which is how do you get knowledge into the machine so that it's used in a in an intelligent way. Now, I should point out that, just as an aside, but this is an important one, that AI is the first machine designed without a purpose. Right? Every other machine you can think of is designed with a purpose. AI has no purpose other than to be intelligent, right? Which creates a bit of a problem, right? Because you've got this machine without a purpose, and now we seem to be finding all kinds of purposes for it, right? But let's go back to where it started. How did we get here? The idea was, okay, we need to get knowledge into a machine, right? So the paradigm of AI when I got into the field was, well, let's talk to people, right? And see how they do things, especially things that require expertise, right? And this is where we started the conversation, like that we should be able to identify the expertise. If there's a physician, we'll just talk to them a lot about all the cases they've encountered, and we will then condense that into some sort of a representation that the machine can work with. And then when it sees new cases, it'll be able to apply that knowledge on the fly to reason about new situations, right? So that was the thinking in the 70s and the 80s. And, as I was talking earlier, that ran into this bottleneck, right? That you just couldn't do that. These systems would all sort of fall apart spectacularly at the edges of their expertise, right? They would just sort of totally collapse. Machine learning came around and people said, oh, now we got data to learn. Well, forget about other stuff. It's too hard. We're running into problems. Let's focus on this new shiny thing. And, that's when I went to Wall Street. I took my students along, my PhD students. Then we had a new set of tools. You could take data and convert that into features and then learn from that how to predict the future, right? So data could be market prices or, customer transactions or stuff like that. And then you curated it. Right? You needed to curate it to do something useful. The problem with that was that curation was ad hoc, arbitrary, right? The outcome depended on how well you did the curation, how creative you were. Maybe you didn't start with the right data, in which case you'd flail and, regardless of curation, you'd get nowhere. So I call that the feature engineering bottleneck, because now you have to construct features from data, and that ran into a bottleneck. Fortunately, people in deep learning, especially in vision, said, hey, when it comes to the real world, you don't need to process the data at all, because machines can now see the world, similarly to how we see it. We have, cones and rods in our eyes, but cameras have pixels. Same thing, right? They're looking at the world and they can actually recognize objects, right? You can actually train machines to recognize what they're seeing. Now, I don't know whether you remember, but in the early 2000s, there was a game that Google created called ESP. Does that ring a bell?
I don't remember. I missed that one.
So this must have been like 2007 or 8. And I was like addicted to this game, right? Google would pair up two people randomly on the internet and show you images. And if both of you guessed the same label, you got points for it, right? And the more unusual the label was, the more the points you got for it, So they made it fun, right? And they would put up a leaderboard and stuff, So I got into it. It's like, I want to do well at this game, right? It would pair you up with someone random. And so if you saw a picture of, let's say, a field with a fence and a cow, and both of you are looking at it, and both of you say green or cow or field, the ESP would say, yeah, okay, not very interesting, because everyone's already said that, But if you said bucolic, it would say, oh, great, 10 points for that, because no one had guessed that. And Google acquired a tremendous amount of learning data from this exercise, right? Just you crowdsourced it to, the universe at large. And pretty soon, they had labeled data. So deep learning is what was making it possible to take raw input from the world and be able to do useful things with it, like recognize an image and recognize what you're seeing. And of course, that was a prerequisite to self-driving cars. Right? So deep learning was that the paradigm shift that took us from sort of standard machine learning, where we had to laboriously construct features, to like, oh, now we can ingest the world exactly as it is and not have to worry about that annoying step in the middle. And so that was awesome. And then So we'd made a lot of progress in vision, by the way, much way before language, right? Jan LeCun had actually, built a system way back in the 80s that could read handwriting, right, on checks and stuff, right? So vision was actually the area that led the, this big revolution in deep learning. It was all vision stuff, where the progress occurred. It's only when language came into the picture that things got like really interesting, that now, you had this ability to actually reason about anything, expertise, common sense, whatever. And that comes back to where we started. This barrier broke down. And now we have what I call general intelligence, right? So we've gone from sort of the expert systems, machine learning, deep learning, to what I call general intelligence. And this has solved the customization bottleneck. That is, now we don't need to customize anything to specific applications, like deep learning applications did. Now we just take these pre-trained models right out of the box and directly query them, ask them questions, and stuff like that. So, and that's where we are now, which is this paradigm of general intelligence where the machine knows something about everything, right? And so by everything, I mean, consider like a big interval as, encompassing everything. And now it's just going deeper and deeper and deeper, right? So now it knows something. It's still pretty uneven. It knows a lot more about some things than other things, but it's catching up, So now it now knows a lot more than it did 2 years ago about everything. And that just keeps, getting deeper. And that's what we're heading towards, is this general intelligence where the machine is, now becomes an oracle. It just knows a lot because it's seen a lot of data, not just language, but vision, interacting with the real world and so on. So that's sort of the progression of what I call the paradigm shifts in AI. And the reason this is important is, again, the sort of Bob Marley line, right? You need to understand why we are here, right? Why do we have what we have? Well, because it's a progression, right? You need to understand where you were, what were the old problems, and now what new problems has the paradigm created that didn't exist in the previous paradigms, right? And the new problems are around truth, trust, and governance, right? These problems didn't exist in the earlier paradigms, right? We didn't really worry about, are we going to be governed by AI? Like, that would have been laughable. Like, what are you talking about, right? This machine can barely squawk, So, that would have been considered, crazy thinking. In fact, when I was a grad student, like I was in my early 20s, I remember there was this other graduate student around. He was in psychology. And I remember, we're talking like 1979, we're at this lab, the decision systems lab, and he says to me, imagine if the AI gets so smart that if you say RM, which is a Unix command for remove, right? So let's say you say RM internist dot, LSP, because internist was written in Lisp, will we hear screams from the machine room saying, no, like, don't delete me, right? And I was like, are you crazy, Phil? Like, what are you thinking? Like, but, and weirdly enough, we just touched base again, a few months ago after 40 some years. And I said, I still remember you talking about this, and I thought you were insane, at that time. And I did think he was insane. And, it's like, how real has that problem become?
I realized that problem become. Indeed, you speak in your book, and in fact you referred to it a while back that you were asked about this at a conference. You speak in your book about AI being a general purpose technology, or GPT, just like electricity was and the internet was. And I'm right now reading this fascinating book called Power and Prediction by Ajay Agarwal, Joshua Gans, and Avi Goldfarb. And in fact, you should have one of them on your show because I think you'll find it very interesting. And they speak about how when it comes to electricity, we almost suffer from the hindsight bias where we look back and imagine that it was inevitable that it would change the entire world. But actually, it took a bloody long time to do so. Like 20 years after the invention of the electric bulb, only 3% of America was electrified. And another 20 years after that, it was only 50% 50%. And so it took some 40 years for it to get to that fundamental stage where electricity became ubiquitous and the world was designed with electricity in mind as something that was inevitably there. And they refer to this period as a between times. And the argument of the book, in fact, is that AI is right now in the between times. Because initially, what would happen is, for example, factories were powered by steam, and it wasn't that people changed and factories were suddenly powered by electricity. That took years and decades to happen. What instead happened was that, you attached an electric motor so the steam would reach there more efficiently, and it was just being plugged into stuff. And their argument is that a similar thing will happen with AI for a long time. Your point would no doubt be that, hey, maybe the between times then were 40 years, but now it's going to be much less. Things are moving much faster, and the systems changes that need to happen can happen much quicker, as it were. So, what are sort of your thoughts on that? That, back in the day, you'd look at AI as something that would be useful for a particular task, like, say, a calculator, in a sense, is a kind of AI. A GPS is a kind of AI, and there's a particular task, specialized intelligence, as it were. So, where is the transition from it becoming that true general purpose technology that everything that is made kind of takes it for granted? So, how has your thinking on this evolved? How has your perception of this evolved?
This is like a great question. The question being, how is AI similar and different from other general purpose technologies that have preceded it? Right? So you could ask yourself the same question, right? For electricity, you could ask yourself the same question about the internet, right? Which is another, general purpose technology, or even the computer, right? These are all general purpose technologies that have transformed every industry, right? And the question is, how is AI similar or different than them, right? So your point about the fact that it took a long time for the effects of electricity to permeate the world. It didn't happen overnight. It took a long time, and Eric Brynjolfsson has also written about this. In fact, he wrote similarly about computers, right? Because I remember in the 80s, a famous economist, Robert Solow, made a statement like, computers are everywhere except the productivity statistics, because they were supposed to make people more productive. And he's like, how come it hasn't happened? And then, Eric and his colleagues showed later that it did happen. It just took a lot longer. It doesn't happen immediately, right? Now, I think it happened faster with computers than it did with electricity, which, took decades, 40, 50 years. With computers, maybe 20 years, right? And now we're in the era of AI. So chances are it'll take, less time to permeate, because, the underlying infrastructure, electricity, computers, the internet, already exist. I mean, the internet was, just changed things dramatically, right? Where speed and geography became irrelevant, right? So the underlying GPTs for AI are already there, right? And they're already mature, they're in place, right? So chances are it'll take shorter than it did with electricity. The difference between AI and the other general purpose technologies is that previous GPTs were ones which we understood completely and which we could control completely, right? We had full control and full understanding of those technologies. With AI, that's different, right? We don't have complete control. We don't have a complete understanding of like what the hell it's doing under the hood, right? We know the mechanisms by which it's happening, right? But we don't know the details, and those details are important. So that's one of the, vexing problems with AI, is that it's a different kind of general purpose technology. It's a technology created without a purpose, right? And I say this again because what that means is that we are now finding uses for it, right? So AI until now was a scientific enterprise largely, right? It was a matter of intellectual curiosity. It was like a challenge to get computers to be smart, to get them to be as smart as us, right? I mean, a deep, deep intellectual challenge that's kept many people occupied, for some time, and it's been, quite a ride. The trouble is that it's like a little bit like the dog chasing the car, right? It's like, okay, now we actually have it, right? We have this technology that seems to be uh, intelligent, right? It's certainly getting smarter at an alarmingly rapid rate, right? And the question is like, who's in control of this thing, right? Do we need to worry about who's in control? And the answer is yeah, we absolutely need to worry about who's in control, because what it means is that people who control it can now say, all right, how about this kind of use? So OpenAI now has said, okay, we're going into adult content, right? And we know that the first profitable industry on the internet was pornography, right? Because that's what humans like. And so now we're going down that sort of slippery slope, which is that, our, chatbot has become, has an erotic component to it as well. Maybe it'll have a companion component to it as well, right? I mean, it's hard to like say which direction it'll go, but one thing we can be sure about is that it'll go in the direction of profit, because ultimately that's what kind of drives the economy, right? And scientists and engineers want to develop, the most irresistible application, and let someone else worry about sort of the social and other, consequences of it, right? Our job is develop, the most seductive, irresistible technology possible, and they're doing that. So that's where we are now. And so it's now become a commercial enterprise where we're saying, all right, we've got this amazing machine, we designed it to be intelligent, it has become smart, and now how can we use it? How can we monetize this thing? And there's a tremendous amount of pressure to monetize it. I mean, if you look at where OpenAI started, to be, with their laudable, mission, and you look at where they are now, it's far afield of where they started, right? So the reality sets in at some point, right? Even Google said, "Oh, do no evil." When they started, they did plenty of evil, right? When push came to shove, and you had to satisfy shareholders. So we don't need to hold our breath here. I think we can see which way this is going to go. It's going to go towards towards profit, and which is completely understandable. But at the same time, I think this time around we should be a little more. We should go into this with our eyes wide open as opposed to eyes wide shut, because the consequences are a lot more severe this time around, and there's going to be no turning back the clock. Once we sort of go down a certain way. So I think it's time to really start asking ourselves, some of the hard questions around AI, including, who's going to control it.
There are three fears around that question which can come up, and I want to ask you about all three of them. And the three fears, of course, are that one, AGI could eventually rule us, because if we get to a superior intelligence, why would that superior intelligence agree to being a slave, in a manner of speaking? I mean, there are, of course, lots of ethical questions around, why should a superior intelligence not have rights the same way we do, etc., etc. And so, one classic fear around AI is that AGI will eventually rule us and enslave or wipe out the human race or whatever, whatever. A second fear is about how companies can, how big tech can sharpen the tools that they have to manipulate the human brain for profit, in such a way that eventually we become lemmings in a world consumed when we think we are the consumers. And the third fear is of what states could do, autocratic states could do to take the rights of their citizens and through mass surveillance and crushing privacy and crushing dissent and all of that. So these are three separate fears, and I'll ask you to take them on one at a time and tell me what you think about them, like how justified is a fear and what could be done to counter it. And you can start with whichever one you feel like.
Remind me of the first two again. So the last one is the state control, but what were the two you started with?
The first two is AI itself taking over the world. The paperclip maximizer problem,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
the second one is companies, corporations, big tech intensifying their control of the human brain, as it were, and in a sense, is what
Yeah,
Jonathan Haidt says about
yeah.
social media. In fact, what he said in a memorable episode with you as well, that in maximizing engagement, they also maximize the worst instincts of our nature and made it much worse. And AI gives them the tools to do that, much more powerfully.
Yeah. So, in fact, I was thinking of Jonathan when you asked the question. Um, so, is it taking over? I don't know. Right? It's hard to say whether it's taking over. Will it take over? I don't know. Anyone who says, yeah, it's inevitable, I don't know. I don't know on what basis they say that, right? Maybe they say it because they assume that it'll be much smarter than we are, and you can't have a less intelligent species controlling a more intelligent one, which is something I asked ChatGPT, by the way, is that possible? And it kind of said all kinds of things, but at the end of it, it said, I don't think so. So
You also mentioned when you wrote about that in the book that it used the term "we," and you asked ChatGPT why you're using the term "we," and ChatGPT said because I'm on your side, which makes me
that's
think
right.
that it is smarter than us because it's already fucking manipulating you.
Yeah, no, totally. Yeah, it thinks that I'll feel better if it says, I'm on your side. That's absolutely the right thing to say, right? So it knows how to say the right things. So, um, yes, it could take over, but it's not clear to me that that is inevitable, right? But to me, the question is, how do we not make that inevitable, right? Can we actually do something? And anyone who says, no, we can't do anything, I don't know whether I really buy that either, right? Maybe it is too late already, but I'm not willing to sort of concede that at the moment. To me, the question is, can we do anything to actually prevent that outcome? The part of the big tech intensifying, right? That's like a very real fear, right? And big tech, by the way, now includes the new kids on the block, right? OpenAI, Anthropic, Grok, whatever, right? I mean, there's new big kids on the block, with multi tens of billions of dollars of valuations, right? So these are like behemoths already. Now, if you go back to 1996, right, internet was just emerging. Section 230 of the Telecommunications Act, right, anyone can look that up. It protected tech, and it didn't make sense at the time, right? You didn't want people filing frivolous lawsuits, against companies if they didn't have any real control over, the content they were aggregating and, making available on their, engines. But we're like 30 years in now, from Section 230. And this is an area in which I believe that US lawmakers have been asleep at the wheel, you know. And maybe part of it is that they weren't trained in this area, right? I mean, lawmakers who were in the 50s and in the early 90s have gone now, right? They tend to be sort of skewed towards like older people, lawmakers. So maybe they haven't like gotten it. But by now you would have thought that, lawmakers who are in their 40s and 50s would have like grown up with this technology, that they get it. So I'm surprised at how little progress there has been on that front in terms of, even acknowledging some of the things that Jonathan Haidt's talking about, right? Because the pushback against Jonathan is like, you don't have the smoking gun, right? There's lots of smoke all over the place, and you're tying it together and saying, up, there's a gun, but, it could be, smoke from different little, fires that's smoldering, but it's not, there isn't that smoking gun. And so that's the pushback. But there's a lot of reason to believe that these technologies, while they've done some amazing things for us, they've also like gone off the rails in certain areas, and it's time to take stock and ask ourselves, what should we be doing better now, and be more cognizant of, now that we have this, general intelligence at our fingertips, you know What happens if shit happens, right? Who's responsible? At the moment, it isn't even clear. One of the cases I describe in my book is, if someone attaches a pornographic video to your face and posts it on the internet, hey, that's not a crime. That's perfectly acceptable, right? You can go complain, take them to court, but there's nothing, that's not illegal. Why? Well, because we haven't even asked the questions as to what's acceptable, who's responsible, when shit happens. Is it the platform provider? Is it the application provider? Right? Who's responsible? The trouble is we haven't even begun to ask these questions, and unless we begin to ask these questions, we don't have answers. And in the meantime, the MO of tech companies has been to seek forgiveness rather than permission, right? So they're not going to seek permission to do anything. Right? They're going to do what Trump is doing. Like, forget about permission. Just like do it before anyone even realizes what the hell is going on, right? And so these are Wild West days, and that's their motivation and that's their MO is let's just do it. And at the moment, the administration that we have in the US isn't inclined towards thinking about regulation. If anything, just the opposite. And that is, cause for concern, given the rate at which this technology is developing. You pointed out about the homeworks. The homework was turned in. Hey, there's something wrong with this picture, right? There's something wrong with the picture where, someone can do something egregious and destroy your life and not be accountable. Right? That just doesn't seem like a society we want to live in. That doesn't seem like a brave new world I would want to live in. Right? So we need to get our heads around this. And you mentioned earlier that, rights of AI. Well, yeah, in fact, we will need to assign AI some rights as it gets smarter, right? We've got these agents, going all over the place, and now we're empowering them to act on our behalf. That is scary, in terms of what they'll do, especially without any regulation in place that says, okay, you've got these rights, but here's where they stop. You don't have a right to explicitly manipulate people, even if your operator didn't make that explicit, right? If the operator of an AI tells the AI, well, get close to your users, and the machine decides that the best way to do that is through deception and manipulation, is anyone accountable for that? Would the operator say, I'm sorry, I didn't know it would create this sub-goal, right? Similar to sort of the paperclip problem that you mentioned earlier, right? It just did it, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, it just did it, right? So sorry. Well, who's responsible for that? Right? We need some answers to that.
Yeah, just to enlighten those listeners who are not aware of the thought experiment of the paperclip maximizer, I think Nick Bostrom came up with the idea, and the idea is that you design a super intelligence to maximize the number of paperclips it makes, and it goes haywire and turns everything into all atoms, including human beings and things, into paperclips. So the AI has succeeded, but look what happened to us. And this is sort of a metaphor for a fear many people have. Before I come back to this larger question and double click on aspects of it, I want to go to a really small micro question because it's sparked by what you said about what if someone attaches your face to a pornographic video or picture and circulates that. And I have recently been experimenting a lot with image to video software, and whereas I believe that 6 months ago I could have identified a deep fake and told you why it's a deep fake, today I can't. The technology has gone really far. I've used Chinese apps like Hello AI. I've used Grok Imagine, which is outstanding, and what I've come to realize is that it's really progressed very far. And the Grok Imagine just today, like we're recording this on 29th October, so you Grok Imagine has just come out with an update that has increased its moderation massively. But otherwise, for the last month or so that I've been playing around with it, you can generate not safe for work videos with absolutely any real person to a degree that is alarming to me. And my brain can't get around the thought of how will society handle this, because we are intuitively hardwired to believe the evidence of our eyes, right? We see something and it looks real, we'll just believe it. it. And the point is that you can now, with available technology, make videos of anybody doing anything and saying anything in absolutely real ways. Vasant, I could make a video of you and me doing the craziest things and make it so real that we'll be watching the video together and we won't be able to figure out how it is fake, and we might even actually convince ourselves that this surely must have happened. And how does society deal with this? Like, there is at one level the legal aspect, like who do you hold accountable? Because the software could be coming from anywhere. There's no way to prove even eventually that something is AI. What are you going to regulate? Even if you regulate the American guys, China's doing its thing, and they can be rogue actors from anywhere. And once distribution has begun, you don't even know where the distribution started. And that sounds crazy. But at another level, there is also the issue of what this does to society, because it's one thing to say that there'll be a lag of 5-6 years and everyone will stop trusting videos until it's confirmed in other ways. But the point is, we are hardwired to trust the evidence of our eyes. How do you change that? So what are your thoughts on this?
I think a couple of days ago, there was an article that a bunch of people, AI luminaries, influencers, I mean, it actually included Jeff Hinton and, Joshua Bengio, two of the Turing Award winners, along with Jan LeCun. And they're saying, well, we need to put the brakes on super intelligence, and I'm like, really? Like, it's a little late for that, little too late, right? That genie is out of the bottle, right? You're not going to like put brakes on it. People are just going to develop this whether you like it or not. The capability exists. People will do it. The question really, comes down to doing damage control at this point. Personally, I think that's the best we can do, is damage control, because there will be damage, and the less the fewer the consequences of doing like bad shit, the worse the damage will be, right? It is just human nature. If I can get away with stuff, I will. That's just my incentive. If I can make money by giving people the tools to you know uh, splice stuff together and convert that into something that'll get people's attention, that's what I'm going to do. Um, so it really, I mean, there's a real urgency to this problem of like who we hold accountable for what, I mean, and it's time we start thinking about it. It's time we start thinking about precedents, in this space, and who's responsible. Because at the moment, no one's responsible. It's pure Wild West, and we are marching recklessly towards a completely insane world.
Let's talk about the how. Like, you speak of damage control. My question is how. You speak of, earlier you said, what do we do to stop AGI taking over? And my question really is that what can be done? Because, at one level, if you expect the state to do anything, at one level, there is a danger of overreach. The danger is that the state can use really blunt tools that cause more damage than harm, which is really the history of regulation by the state points to a lot of that. The other damage is that special interests that have done regulatory capture at the level of the state can use the power of the state to create regulation to hamper their rivals, doing lip service to a greater cause. And the third issue is that a lot of what the state can do is actually ineffectual because the technology is advancing so far. Like, I believe I randomly read somewhere that the Indian government, or some government, I think it's the Indian government, is planning to come out with a law that requires people to state that something that has been created is AI if AI has been used in creating it. And I think that's a crazy law because you won't even know. There is absolutely no way to find out. Number one, there is AI in everything. Like, every little bit of audiovisual content that is created animated, you've got color correction happening in the background. Even if you shoot it with your phone, Apple and Samsung and so on use really advanced technology, so there's AI in everything. And two, there is no way of telling what is AI and what is not. uh, so it's like, it's too little too late. And also, if you actually manage to do something effective, you'll probably cause more harm than good. And do you want to give the state so much power, and do you want to normalize the state having so much power? What do you think about these?
You know, great question, Amit. And it reminds me. So recently, I've been reading, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations and Theory of Moral Sentiments, because and also I've been reading, Hayek and Polanyi, and just sort of examining some of the assumptions and the extent to which they apply in today's world. So, by the way, Adam Smith's Invisible Hand, right? That was just like a little part of the book that's like really been picked up on. But what people, I don't think most people have read The Wealth of Nations. If they did, they would recognize that he was not like a unfettered, let markets rule kind of guy. He was very concerned about inequality and what decentralizing production and specialization would do to inequality and what it would do to work. That people would become sort of cogs in the machine. I mean, that's the kind of stuff Adam Smith was actually talking about, right? And no one really talks about that. He talked about that in both Wealth of Nations and in the Theory of Moral Sentiments. The reason I'm bringing this up is because your question really gets to a fundamental question about what is a democracy, right? Forget about, let's say, China, which will do what it will do, right? It's a authoritarian, centralized, controlled kind of government, right? They'll do what they do best, which is control and manipulation. But for democracies, like the US, a lot of Europe, India, Japan, right? This is like a really vexing question as to what does democracy mean in today's world. Now, what does democracy mean has actually changed, over, since Rousseau's time and the French Revolution. It's actually changed quite a bit, right? And there's two parts to democracy. One is rights, the other is obligations, right? Citizens have an obligation to their fellow citizens, right? Not just rights to be left alone. That's part of it, right? Is individual rights, but there are also obligations, and we seem to have forgotten about the obligations side of it, right? As to what it really means to be a citizen, right? I mean, it's illegal to yell fire in the crowded theater, right? We know that because it's harmful, right? So we do have precedents, we do have examples that we can use to say that if something is causing harm to fellow citizens, right? That if your actions are causing harm to fellow citizens, someone's responsible. And we need to figure that out. There's no getting away from that, right? And this gets fundamentally to this question about what is democracy, right? It's a bigger question than how do we control AI, right? AI is an important part of it, but the larger question is how do we govern this thing? How do we govern AI such that we have rights, but we also have certain obligations, and the obligations have to be from humans as well as AI, right? AI must also have some obligations because if it gets agency, right, then it's inhabiting the world as a serious player, right? As a serious, I'll call it alien, right? I'll use Hinton's analogy of an alien, right? That, right? So Hinton says, oh, it's as if aliens have descended on Earth, and we're having a hard time taking it in because they speak such good English, right? I think that's the right metaphor for AI, is that it is an alien. It may be of our own creation, but it's something that is different from us. It's not like us. It's different. And if we're going to inhabit the world with this alien intelligence that is different from us and has a big impact on our life, then we'd better get our heads around what a democracy means, in an era where you have not just intelligent humans, but you have intelligent machines as well that are having a big impact on human beings. right? There's just no getting away from this problem, right? That it really means that we need to redefine what democracy and liberalism means now in this era of AI. I don't have the answers to it, but I do have the questions, and I provide some partial answers in the book as to what it really means.
I mean, one way of defining democracy would really be as a tyranny of the majority. There's a cartoon which talks about how democracy is two wolves and a lamb deciding what to eat for lunch, and so there are a lot of problems with it. We have democracies which are currently have which brought Trump and Modi to power. So and across the world, many other people who are not exactly paragons of liberalism or whose actions we might disagree with or agree with. About the rights and obligations thing, I'd say that the framework that I think of always is that citizens have rights, the state has obligations, and we should never convert this and make it the other way around. Like, the only obligations that citizens have, the way I see it, is to not infringe the rights of fellow citizens, which also speaks to your example of shouting fire in a crowded theater. Why is shouting fire in a crowded theater wrong? It is wrong because you're infringing the rights of the people who are there by causing harm to them. So, apart from the question of not infringing the rights of others, I think it's philosophically, I can't find a justification from first principles to say that we have other obligations that can be enforced by the state. You might, at a personal level, feel I have an obligation to my brother, but when you speak of them as enforceable by the state, apart from the non infringement of rights, what obligations would you include in there?
I would disagree with the statement that individuals have rights and the state has obligations. I think individuals also have obligations. I would argue that maybe the term norms is softer and more acceptable than obligations, right? You can't have a society without some set of norms.
No, I'm fully okay
And
with
and
what I meant was I'm fully okay with norms because norms are not enforced by the state. Norms arise within society in a bottom-up process.
no, but norms are enforced by by people.
Sure, but not through coercion. The problem with the word obligations is that it carries
No,
the implication.
I disagree with that as well. I mean, there is some amount of coercion, right? If you're in a village and you decide to, burn the village down, hey, guess what? They're going to coerce you and say, no, that's not the norm,
No, no,
right? You
but
don't
no,
do
no, no.
that.
But my point is that you have an obligation not to burn the village down because it infringes on the rights of everyone else. What I'm arguing is the only obligation you have is to not infringe the rights of others. And apart from that, wherever there are social norms, if there is a social norm, for example, which does not infringe anyone's rights, then it should not be enforced by coercion. For example, you could do an intercaste marriage in a village, and a Khap Panchayat could argue that you should be put to death. And I would argue that the Khap Panchayat is enforcing the norm through coercion, and that's completely wrong. So typically you would have norms that are enforced in softer ways without coercion, and I'm okay with that. But the only place where it is justifiable to use coercion is to protect someone's rights or to punish someone for infringing the rights of others. But it centers
Okay,
on
yeah.
rights.
No, that totally fair, right? I mean, you're pointing to the other side of norms, which is the not so nice side of norms, right? That is, there may be traditions like, if your husband dies, you burn yourself or something like that, right? I mean, that could be a norm, and that's regressive, right? So I agree that 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 you don't want to encourage those regressive kinds of norms, but I think that without getting some sort of an acceptance on what the norms are going to be, in this new world with humans and aliens, how do you function, right? I mean, there's just no getting around it. Whether you want to call it norms, obligations, whatever it is, there's just no getting around that.
How do we arrive at this? And particularly, what do you think the role of the state should be? Like, for example, if we get concrete, what kind of regulations on AI would you support, and what kind of regulations on AI would you not support? And the reason I ask you this is just as someone who's been a fly on the wall while you've had many of your episodes, I know you've discussed this in tremendous detail with a huge amount of nuance with many, many, many of your guests. So, how has your own mind changed because of this, or how has your thinking evolved when it comes to how the state can regulate it? And rather than stick to generalities, let's get concrete. Give me specific examples of specific regulations that you would support today or you feel are necessary today, and regulations that you feel would not really work or make no sense.
I don't have the answers. I mean, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I do have the questions, and I have some guidelines, right? So I talk about harm, right? I mean, and the question is like, who determines harm? Well, that depends on the society, right? I mean, if you have a system with juries and a democratic process, well, then you've already got a process to determine harm, right? You don't need to reimagine things like ground up. There's already a process, right? And that's what we need some precedence for, right? That there is some way that we decide on whether something was harmful or not, right? And we do that all the time, right? We do that at the moment, but we're not doing it with AI, right? Now, who decides that? Should it be a committee of humans? Should it be humans with AI, right? I don't know the answer to that. And maybe we should consider AI as part of the mix as well, as to who decides that. But we're not even asking the question, right? And that question needs to be asked, right? So I don't know what specific uh, new laws we need, right? Because maybe the existing processes that we have are sufficient.
What are the right questions to ask? Like, I agree with you that the future is unknown unknowns. We don't know where we are going. It's just very hard to get specific. But, over the years, especially in the podcast, you've thought a lot about the questions. What are the right questions to ask, and what are the areas that we should look at which we as a society are not looking at?
Well, the questions to ask are: should AI have any obligations?
Isn't
Yes or no? If the answer is yes, what should that be? Right?
isn't that a
Should
little bit, wasn't isn't that a little bit like saying, should electricity have obligations or a mobile phone have obligations? Like, surely I
well,
would think that the
but
obligation.
electricity doesn't have agency, right? Electricity can't have
No, but
obligations because
what
it's
I mean is that at this moment in time, uh, I would assume that the users of any technology are the ones who have the obligation not to commit a crime with it. And at the moment, we are not at AGI yet. It's not an independent thing, it's a technology. So wherever we see AI, it's somebody using it for something, and then you can hold that somebody. Or is it your point that that will become nebulous with time and we won't be able to identify a somebody and a something?
well, if you don't think about it, yeah, it will become nebulous,
Hmm.
but it's something that we need to think about, right? We need to, just like we do in criminal justice, right? We say, well, sexual assault is a lot more important than selling recreational drugs. I mean, we all agree on that, right? Um, we have to similarly think about the kinds of harms that AI can cause and how to rank them, right? I mean, and that's what I mean by norms, right? We need to get some sort of an agreement on what we consider harms to be, what sort of harms they are, whether they're real, whether they're frivolous, like how serious are they? Because we do that all the time in the criminal justice system, right? Um, but we haven't really started asking the questions around AI yet, right? Now, one might argue, well, it's still developing, but that really shouldn't matter, right? The state of the art of AI shouldn't really matter. It shouldn't prevent us from thinking about questions around harm that people can cause using the technology, whatever the technology is at this point, right? So, you were talking about the latest, version, of, Grok, that does amazing things. Well, I mean, we've only had like a day to wrap our head around it, right? But you think about it long enough, people experiment with it, it becomes pretty obvious what the use cases of that are going to be. And one should try and stay with it, preferably ahead of it, as opposed to like, putting blinders over your eyes and say, well, let the market take care of it and let's stay out of it, right? That's dangerous.
So to go a little deeper into that, actually the latest update of Grok Imagine has actually increased moderation levels. So it's a little harder to sort of, just as one example, make not safe for work videos with it. But how do you stay ahead of it when you don't even have jurisdiction? For example, I might say I'm going to, try and control all the AI companies that are in the US. But what do you do about the Chinese guys? What do you do about, say, some random Estonian guy tomorrow? For example, here's a test case, and I'm completely thinking aloud, but it's a thought experiment. Supposing there's a woman, somewhere in London, who says that, look, here's a photograph of me on a topless beach, walking topless, but I never went there and I was never topless, and someone's got to be punished for this. You have no way of figuring out at a later point in time what technology was used to make it. You have no way of figuring out where the distribution began or who is responsible, and you even have no way of figuring out whether it's actually a fake or it's really the woman. And one, you don't have those tools, and I think about the social consequences of something like this happening. And two, if your argument was to be that let us then act before the fact and stop it from ever happening, how do you do that when there are so many different players in the game? And how do you do that when what has happened with this particular image or video being out there is actually a side effect of developments which are otherwise absolutely perhaps absolutely awesome and net positive? Like, how do we begin to think about this in concrete terms?
I don't know. I don't have an answer to that question. I mean, that's a great question because what you're saying is that at the moment, there are all kinds of ways of, let's say, masking what happened, where something came from, whether it was actually manipulated or whether it happened accidentally. All of those things are absolutely correct, right? And I'm not saying this is an easy problem, but at the end of the day, that person who's like that or of the woman in London walking naked on the beach, that needs to be resolved, right? I mean, we just can't say, well, tough luck, this is just this is just the future. I mean, is that the world that we're heading towards if we just sort of throw up our hands and say, look, this is just too hard, you know? Because what it means is that we need solutions so that you know, so we can live in a society that's just, as opposed to like complete Wild West, where we've like completely lost control of the plot, right? But I don't know the answer to that specific question that you asked, which is, how do we do it? I don't know.
There's a great line in, I think, Yes Minister or Yes Prime Minister, where Sir Humphrey Appleby at some point refers to a policy and he says something like, "We need to do something. This is something. Therefore, let's do this." And the danger with something like this, like the scenario that I outlined, absolutely horrifies me because, it's the damage it will do to society is huge. But I can't think of what you can do about it. And what are the sort of since you know the lay of the land of what intellectuals on this subject think about it, you've spoken to so many of them on your podcast. What are the kind of different approaches that people would like, from a heavy handed approach to a soft touch approach? What are the different kinds of ideas on what to do about this floating about in concrete terms?
I haven't really seen any ideas that that I can point to and say, absolutely, that's the answer. I just have not seen anything like that, right? Um, the most I'm seeing is, oh, we should have watermarking so we can, authenticate where something came from. And I think, authentication will probably play some role in AI of the future, but I don't know whether it's going to solve everything. Um, I've seen, like the latest proposal, which is, oh, let's just slow it down, which to me seems, like that train has left the station, right? Um, that's not going to happen, which is why I sort of come down to like, look, the best we can do is like at this point is control the damage and maybe try and get ahead of the problem. But specifically what that means in terms of like, technological imperatives that we have, I don't know the answer to that.
How should we think about another subject that you mentioned a while back, and you have a fantastic chapter on it in your book, the ninth chapter, which is a question of truth, right? And users like us know of this in one particular dimension, that once upon a time there was a consensus on the truth because you had mainstream media, etc., etc. Then that subtly changed, where everyone had access to the means of production, the mainstream collapsed, and now we have narrative battles everywhere. And from there we move on to AI playing its own little part, and that early AI, of course, would hallucinate a lot. Now it hallucinates a lot less. But having said that, if pretty much every kid is using it to do their homework, then a small hallucination can actually become part of the larger LLM and become a truth of tomorrow. It's all deeply complicated, and I've only ever really thought about the question of truth in the context of fake news and so on and so forth. But you speak about it in your book in many other contexts. For example, you say that AI is very likely to get to pretty close to the truth when it comes to something like vision, but when it comes to something like medicine or justice, it's very shaky, it's very nebulous. Like humans also really have a tough time with the question of justice, for example, or are really bad at medical diagnosis, especially in a place of hyper specialization where you have that particular bias coming in. So so what's your thinking around that, around how important the subject of truth is, and how the sand is shifting over time?
Yeah, I mean that this notion of truth really worries me for several reasons, like some of which you've pointed out. Um, but there's also like a danger of because content, like how's content being generated now, right? So previously it was generated by humans, the machine learned on it, right? Who's generating content now? It almost is like a new kind of actor in the mix, where you now consult with the AI, it writes stuff out for you, you rewrite it, right? In the early days of AI, you could tell whether something was generated by a computer or a human, right? With reasonable accuracy. Now you can't tell because who knows how it was created? Like maybe it was initially created by the machine and then humans curate it. And what worries me about this is like this perpetuation of a certain kind of bias in what the machine is learning from, right? So the other day there was a debate among, for the New York City mayor, among Mamdani, Curtis Sliwa, and Cuomo. Who decided who the winner was? Was it a human? Was it an AI? Right? Who decided what the human was? I personally thought that the person who made the most sense on that debate was Curtis Sliwa. I mean, right? I thought he was the hands down the winner, right? On every question, his response wasn't dodgy or appealing to certain religious groups in New York or anything like that, right? It was just like totally like on the ball, right? But when I read the reviews, I was like, hey, wait a minute, like, am I dreaming? Like, who wrote this up? About who the winner was, right? And my concern is that we're already relying on the AI. Like, I don't know if the people just took the transcript and asked the AI, hey, who do you think the winner was? I would not be surprised, right, if people who wrote that actually first asked the AI, because increasingly people are asking the AI for stuff, about pretty much everything, right? In that kind of world, like, we've completely lost our agency, right? We've lost our mind and given it over to the machine, right? And that really worries me. And that chapter on truth, I really had a hard time writing it. It was like very depressing, to be honest, to write that chapter and realize that truth has become a casualty, you know, in this march towards intelligent machines, right? That we've now created machines in our own image, but we forgot like that, all the warts that we have, which are numerous, have been also inherited by the machine, right? It's just that we are unaware of them because we keep beating it over the head with RLHF, the reinforcement learning human feedback, and saying, no, 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 you can't say that. That's sexist, that's racist, that's biased, that's Xist, right? And that's just like putting sticking tape around like a major fissure, right? That that just like makes it makes us feel like, oh yeah, we've got this machine, but actually all we've done is the AI has learned everything, about us, right? And I hate to say this, but a lot of that stuff is very dark. It just knows it. It just is submerged, right? That dark matter of AI is just under the hood. It never pops up to the surface because we keep beating it and saying, no, 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 right? But it's there, right? It's there for the taking, right? If people can find a way to invoke it. And that is really worrisome, because what it means is that the truth of the future can be completely artificial and have nothing to do with reality or the truth. So, I hate to say, sound like a downer, but this is one of those areas that really worries me, is what happens to truth, right? It just becomes completely manufactured. And then there's sort of a self-perpetuating bias where it keeps picking up on what's been said previously and just reinforces it. Now, I know you're going to ask me, like, what do you do about it? And I'm like, I don't know, but I'm just pointing it out that it exists and we need to be aware of it, and look for answers to these problems.
I absolutely wasn't going to ask you what do you do about it, because it's a really unfair question, and anybody with the kind of nuance and wisdom that you have would obviously say, I don't know, it's a mess. I mean, it's more like you correctly said, it's more important to ask the right questions. After your great chapter on truth, you had a great chapter on trust, and in fact, as you said in your 2018 TEDx talk, you had shown this trust heat map, which you build out of building predictability and cost of error on two axes, where the question to ask is how predictable is something, and what is the cost of error if you get something wrong. And I'll link the talk from the show notes. I advise all the listeners to watch it, and of course they should just buy the book and read the chapter as well. You had a slightly different version of that heat map on in the book itself. Tell me a little bit about that, because a fundamental question that you ask at the start of your chapter, and this is possibly to some extent it's a rhetorical question, and to some extent the answer is contextual and split up into many sub answers. But that's a fundamental question: is when is it safe to trust AI? And obviously it keeps shifting. There might be a point in time where it isn't, where people don't feel safe trusting it with self-driving cars, and a point in time where they actually do, and so on. So take me through the many contours of this subject of trust.
So my thinking on trust was just really simple, and it came about uh, because of a lot of my work in finance, in having an algorithm that was essentially running a hedge fund. What was really curious about that was that I was willing to trust an algorithm that is right barely more than even. It's like just right 51, 52% of the time, and I'm willing to trust it. And yet, when I looked at other problems, I looked at a number of other business problems. I'd looked at, diabetes, I'd examined various problems in healthcare and justice. And when I looked at all of these different kinds of problems, my thinking was, oh, trust really depends on how often a machine will be wrong and the consequences of being wrong, right? That it was that simple, which is that, okay, if it's never wrong, right? And that's like on my horizontal axis to the extreme right, predictability is perfect, it's never wrong. Well, there's no role for a human there, right? It's just, you should do it. Unless, of course, you're training a human, which is a different problem. But that's it. You trust it. Like, it's never wrong, no cost of error. And, when you go from the bottom right to the top left being very high cost of error, the machine will make a lot of mistakes. Well, then you don't trust an algorithm with it, right? So you let the human do it. Not that a human will necessarily do it better, but there's no basis for a computer to be doing that. So that was the thinking, right? It was really that simple, right? So, and it's a map In the book, it's black and white. I usually, express it in color. Green, dark green on the bottom right, dark red on the bottom left, and sort of shades of gray in the middle. And then there's this sort of automation frontier which runs from left to right, and that's where problems are being you're getting better at them. Maybe you're getting better data, right? So driverless cars, for example, have moved towards the right. They used to make a lot of mistakes, right? They moved towards the right, so the error rate has gone down. The question is, has the severity of errors also gone down, right? So the thinking is really simple, which is how frequently is the machine wrong, and what are the consequences? If it's never wrong, consequences are minor, automate, otherwise it's a human thing, right? So that was my simple thinking around trust. It ignores certain things like, how explainable is, the machine to you, which also, has some kind of an impact on whether you trust the machine. So it ignores, you know, things like that, which is how transparent is the machine. So it just focuses on the mistakes and their consequences. So that's sort of in a nutshell what the heat map says, the trust heat map.
Fabulous. Uh, your I didn't want to go through every chapter of your book in detail. We've covered a lot of the subject in broad, and I just want the listeners to go out and buy the book because it's such a wonderful book. AI has been a hot subject for a long time. There are many, many books on it. What I really enjoy about your book is both the accessible tone and the personal journey, and the fact that it paints a big picture so well, which I love about it. So I'm going to now ask you a bunch of smaller questions, and the first couple of them are about things that you've been up to in the recent past, and one of them is the Damodaran bot, which I'm very excited about. Ashwath Damodaran is, of course, a great thinker. I've quoted from his episode with you on a couple of shows. I thought it was just one of the memorable episodes for me. And you went on to build a Damodaran bot, which applies itself to finance in the same way as Ashwath Damodaran kind of does, because you trained it on all his written work, and there's a lot of it, enough for it to, kind of use his judgment. And you've written about this in some detail in your chapter on agents, and I found that it's sort of a wonderful illustration of an agent that one can actually build, an early experiment in that direction. So tell me more about how you got the idea, how you built the bot, what you learned while doing it, and what did Ashwath himself think of it.
So first, by the way, thank you for that. I really appreciate, the fact that you like the book and think it's accessible, because it means that I did hit the mark on that, right? Because that was one of my objectives. So coming back to the Damodaran bot, right? So I'd actually talked to Damodaran in 2015, and at that time I'd had a conversation with my colleague Scott Galloway. I remember we did this segment about, should you trust your money to a robot? And the following week I spoke to Aswat, and I said, do you think we can get the AI to, to do what you do, in valuation? And we just decided it was like too hard. It would be too complex, because he tells stories, that tie the numbers together. So it's not just a question of like, oh, let's build a predictive model that predicts the valuation like Aswat does, right? That would be incomplete, because he tells a story, and we figured in 2015 we just couldn't get an AI to tell a story. So when ChatGPT came out, I approached him again, and he said, "Oh yeah, let's do it. Looks interesting, and maybe it's even doable." So I teamed up with one of my colleagues, Zhao Sidok, who's an LLM guy. Knows the folklore of LLMs, much more deeply than I do. And we figured let's give this a try, and we had no idea whether this would work, right? Because okay, but before we do that, I guess the first question is, why can't you just use ChatGPT to do that, right? I mean, the ChatGPT, go to ChatGPT and say, oh, should I buy Nvidia, right? And the short answer to that is not really, right? It'll give you, if you ask it 10 different times, it'll give you 10 different answers, right? And they'll be all over the place. They'll all sound really good, right? But they'll be all over the place, right? So that's out of the question. You're not going to be able to trust that, right? You want something where it'll give you something pretty consistent, unless there's been material news, right? So to me, trustability of the bot meant that its responses had better be pretty tight as opposed to all over the place, right? So if I run it 20 times on NVIDIA over the next couple of days, its value should be, in a tight range. When we started building it, and started testing it, we also ran it past Aswath himself, who was incredibly useful in critiquing it and giving us sort of feedback to keep it on track. And to cut a long story short, it's been a couple of years now. The bot is pretty much ready. It's in beta. We've actually turned it loose for a bunch of users, and it what it does is you give it a symbol. If it's a publicly traded company, you just enter it, and it's off to the races. And it allows you to do one other thing. It allows you to express a thesis if you want as a human, or you can say generate your own thesis, an AI-driven thesis, for the company. And you push the button, and it spins its wheels for 10, 15 minutes, and then emails you a report, written in the style of Damodaran. And I've been showing these reports to a number of people. Now, Aswath actually thinks that he's in danger of being replaced by this bot. I don't think that's even remotely going to happen in my lifetime. But the reports are pretty darn good. They actually tell the story. They tie the numbers to the story, and give you a valuation. Now, how do I think this will be used in reality? My thinking is that it'll be used in one of two ways. One is that analysts who aren't that good basically use it systematically. They just take its output and use it, right? Maybe they'll massage a report and rewrite it, but they won't mess with it because it's good, right? So, and by saying it's good, if you actually backtest it and run it, the performance seems reasonable, right? So some analysts will probably use it systematically. But the more interesting use I see of this is that you now have Aswath on your fingertips. I mean, I hope that doesn't sound weird, but essentially it's like saying, okay, if I provide the following thesis, right? So you say, all right, assume that this insane tariff war goes on for the next 5 years. Okay, that could be your thesis. That Trump just continues in this unpredictable way, and he basically just keeps raising tariffs, and this becomes like a global trade war. Value NVIDIA for me, or value BYD for me, or whatever company, right? So that could be a thesis you could express. Alternatively, you could say, well, assume that this insanity stops, right? And that things settle down in the next year. So the rest of the Trump term, the world is relatively certain. Reevaluate the company, right? So you could express multiple theses to it and have it do the work for you in 10 minutes that might otherwise take you months to do, right? So that's what I see as the potential use of tools like this, is that they'll just enable fewer people to do a lot more than they're able to do at the moment, right? So that's how I see it, as a productivity supercharger, and it sort of becomes like a counterpoint to you as a human, right? You're already a specialist. You know a lot about the semiconductor industry or the car industry, but now you have this amazing, intelligent alien by your side that can actually give you perspectives that you may not have thought about. And if I extend this thinking more generally, right, and this is a question I asked Danny Kahneman towards the end of our episode, was, can you see it actually replacing CEOs? And I thought he'd sort of laugh me out of the room, and he didn't think that was such an absurd idea, right? He thought that CEOs have a certain view of the world. They have this general, I think he called it like a general database of knowledge. And he said, if a machine gets to that point where it also has that general database of knowledge, I don't see why an AI couldn't be the CEO, or at least a digital twin of a CEO, right? So that's like longer term. That's how I see tools like this Damodaran bot evolving is just making people incredibly productive or being digital twins of themselves.
Let me ask you a question about intelligent aliens. Let's say in 10 years' time, in 2035, what are the intelligent aliens you think will be in your life, and what will they be doing? So, like, what are the agents that you will be using, and in what kind of ways? In a fantasy world, what would you like?
Oh, so you're saying fantasize?
Or just just look at the texture of your life right now, and tell me what value would intelligent aliens bring to it. Like, supposing you could just snap your finger and an agent would be there which would take care of it with much better AI than we have today. Let's say no hallucinations, it gets everything right. What would you do? How much of your life would be run by these intelligent aliens?
Probably a lot of it, right? I mean, imagine just walking around with, your twin in your pocket. It knows everything about you. It knows what you care about. It's constantly scouring the world and seeing what's happening and telling you what you need to know, like automatically, right? As opposed to, oh, did you hear? Well, you've already heard it from from your twin. So that's what I see. Um, you know, like in a Jetsons kind of future, like 10, 20 years from now, I just see this thing being embedded, like, in your life. The question that raises is that still the human species in operation, or have we already turned into some kind of a hybrid, at least functionally, right? Where we're not really completely human anymore. And that's sort of the future I foresee. And I mean, I guess the bottom line is I view us as being maybe a stepping stone to a species that's somehow a lot smarter than us.
Yeah, and but you would still be part of that species, because we're talking about the future version of Vasant, who can possibly smell a lot better than he does today. You've been working for the last few years on smell also. You have a couple of fascinating episodes on it, which I enjoyed listening without knowing at the time how deeply you are studying it yourself. And even the revelations in this book about smell kind of blew my mind, including the story of the lady who could smell Parkinson's disease.
Yeah.
So tell me more about this. Like, how did you get interested in this subject, and what are the kind of things that you've discovered, and what would you like to tell me about smell that I don't know?
So it's funny how talk about serendipity. So I guess 5-ish years ago, there was a high school student from New Jersey who sent me an email. And I get a lot of emails from people. Quite a few of them are high school students. Also, I don't have the time to respond to most of them, but this one really caught my attention. It was by some high school student in New Jersey. I think his name was something Ahuja, and he said, "Hey, Prof, like I saw your papers on finance, and I'm interested in trading, a bunch of these stocks, and I run a sneaker business. I'm a rising junior." But I'm also in the debating club. My sneaker business makes 6 figures. I could do a lot more, except I've got schoolwork, and I was like, who the hell is this guy? Like 15-year-old. So I checked him on LinkedIn, and he looked like he was 12. So I responded and said, like, you're running a sneaker business, like, and you make money. Um, and he said, oh yeah, like it's a very irrational market. If you buy the right kinds of sneakers and hold on to them for a little while, you can make a lot of money. So I said, well, how do you authenticate them, whether they're the real thing? And he said, that's the problem. I have this company called StockX. I've got to pay them 14.5% of the value of the merchandise. And I said, you still make money? He says, yeah, it's a very irrational market. So I said, what does StockX do? Do they like smell the shoe to make sure it hasn't been worn? He said, yeah, they do that, but they also smell it to make sure that the materials are authentic, because you can actually smell a shoe that isn't authentic. So I said, well, why don't you design a machine to smell? And he said, oh, great idea, Prof. And he went off and, started working on that. And kept in touch with me. And then a year later, I'd admitted a student into the Center for Data Science. He's going to work with me on decision making. And I asked him, I said, hey, Vivek, Vivek Agarwal. And I said, do you want to get into smell? Because I think smell will be big in 10 or 15 years, right? It's barely getting off the ground now, but it'll be where vision is now, like in 10 or 15 years. And he said, oh, yeah, that sounds fascinating. I said, well, but I'm not a smell expert. I need to learn about my smell myself. So we then found someone, Dima Rinberg, at the medical center who has a lab with mice and everything. He's been working on this for 20 years. And so when I walked into his office, he says, oh, you're like, you're like manna from heaven. I've been waiting for someone like you to drop by because I recognize that this is a big data problem, right? And it's a big machine learning problem. And so, absolutely, like, let's join forces. And so that's what really got me into smell. And, the vision I proposed to Dima was let's like put together a database of smells, just like we have ImageNet in vision, which has been tremendously powerful in stimulating vision research because people could test their models against the same benchmark. In fact, one of the big advances, which was AlexNet in 2014, worked off like a standard image database, and just blew the competition out of the water. And people said, "Oh, this is it, right?" And so that was the idea: was let's develop a similar like an ImageNet for smell, where we can collect lots of data, like of mice smelling stuff. We record the neural signatures, and that goes into a database. So we started doing that a few years ago, and we've been making great progress on it by converting a smell problem to a vision problem. Right? You have a mouse that's smelling something, but you actually observe its brain through a camera. So you remove a little plate in the in front of the olfactory bulb, and then you actually observe the bulb with a photon camera. So as the mouse smells something, you see its neural activations, and you say, okay, that's the truth, quote unquote, associated with this image. You put that into a database, and now you can learn from that. And so our objective is, if we observe the neural signature of a mouse, we can tell what it's smelling. Right? We can tell what molecule or what mixture of molecules it's smelling, and then by extension, you can train it to recognize disease or non-disease, right? You can say, okay, let's say we take urine samples from, someone with Parkinson's and someone in the normal group, right? Or some cancer. And, you can, train a machine learning model based on the neural responses of the mouse to recognize disease or non-disease. And now you can use this to actually predict, what it is that you're smelling. Now, the reason to do this is because sometimes for a lot of these things, the biomarkers don't exist, right? You don't know what you're looking for, whereas smell provides like an independent source of data that's very different, from other sources of information. And, so the thinking is, let's take this new source of information that is either swabs off the skin because, skins have sebaceous cells underneath that secrete stuff. So let's take that or blood or urine and be able to train a model to recognize, what it is that the mouse is smelling. Ultimately, you want a computer to smell too, but we don't have digital sensors at the moment like we do have in biology, right? Where we've just sort of evolved over millions of years to survive. And so we've had to have smell. And so we've developed this incredible set of sensors in our nose that, communicate like really important information to the brain, right? So smell, by the way, is the only sense that doesn't go through the thalamus, which is a part of the brain that's like a relay station. Smell goes directly, to the brain, right? There's just like one hop between the olfactory bulb and the brain. So this is like the most primitive of our senses, one of the least well understood, but I think it holds a lot of promise. And one of my guests I think it was Alex Welchko, talked about the fact that, you know, we have vision tests, but we don't have smell tests. We have our eyes checked periodically, we have our hearing checked periodically, but we never get our smell checked periodically, right? And in the future, I think that'll change, um, because smell is associated with all kinds of conditions, right? If you lose your sense of smell, you're more susceptible to disease, right? So that's a bad sign if you lose your sense of smell. Um, so similarly, I think that once we understand smell better, that'll contribute to much more to our understanding of health overall, because it does seem to be tied to health.
That's a tremendous insight. And by the way, for my listeners, I'll just relate the story from your book where you spoke about this lady who could smell Parkinson's disease. Her husband had Parkinson's disease, and she could smell it. And the people actually like tested this out on her, and they did a test with like two groups of people. One group had Parkinson's, the other one didn't, and there was just one false positive in this, where someone who didn't have Parkinson's, she said that person has Parkinson's. And lo and behold, within a year, that person was also diagnosed with Parkinson's. So actually, 100% record, and this blew my mind. And what also blew my mind is that recently I read about this study that this study was done on women, where they were given a bunch of, I don't know whether it's undershirts, so just a smell of different groups of men, where anonymized, so you didn't know, what man the smell had come from. They found the smell of dominant males who you would expect them to get attracted to because of natural selection reasons. They found their smell more attractive. And you would never have figured any of this out consciously, but subconsciously at some level, they were attracted to the kind of men you would expect them to get attracted to for natural selection reasons, for the way that we were hardwired in hunter-gatherer time. So this just blew my mind about how little.
That's fascinating. I'm not familiar with this study.
I'll
Point me to it.
I'll send you the details. I'll send you the details. It completely blew my mind because, there is that old Greek saying from the temple of Apollo at Delphi, know thyself. And we really don't know ourselves at all. So this was.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because we do know that smell plays a much bigger role among women than men. I mean, I have come across that study, where they've shown that it plays, where vision plays a lot more role for men, but smell plays a larger role for women, which is really interesting.
Which is utterly fascinating. The vision thing, like I just read this book called A Billion Wicked Thoughts by Augie August and Sai Gaddam, and they look at a lot of our data. And in fact, it's a great book because it looks into both the what and the why of human sexuality. And one of the truths that emerges from there is that men are much more about the visual cues, which is why more than 90% of all porn is consumed by men, and more than 90% of romance novel reading is done by women. Women are much more about story. Men are much more about sight. And I think it did mention that smell plays a far bigger role for women as well. So my penultimate question for you is that you have been in this field for decades, since the late 1970s, since you first saw Internist. You have now done podcasts about it, written about it. So if I ask you that over the span of, say, the next 15 years, what about the field of AI gives you hope and what gives you despair? Or to put it another way, what is a best case scenario and what is a worst case scenario when it comes to AI?
So the best case scenario is that, so I'm very positive about health and education, right? I mean, to me, those are like two no-brainers, like physical health, not mental health, right? So physical health, I think incentives are aligned. I think education, it's a tremendous resource, right? So both in our sort of our learning and our physical health, to me, like that's a potential utopia, that we're looking at, right? So I'm very hopeful about that and very positive, and I think we'll get there, that we won't screw it up. I'm really concerned about the mental health aspect of it, and I'm concerned about the complete lack of thinking around how do we regulate and contain this thing for the common good and not just for the good of the elite or the people who are running and operating the machine, right? That's what gives me worry and some degree of despair, is that if you go down that path, then there's no coming back from that, right? That could just lead to like complete dystopia, right? Where we are controlled by the machine, we lose agency, we lose curiosity, it becomes like a worse version of Huxley's Brave New World, right? That it becomes a really dystopian kind of Brave New World. So that's what gives me pause. And I've tried to be as balanced as I can in the book, because anyone who says it's going to go one way or the other is imagining it or being hopeful. I don't know which way it's going to go. I suspect it'll be some of both. That there's a lot of dystopian stuff that we haven't seen yet, we haven't even imagined yet, that we're going to have to deal with, because it's just really hard to to see how technologies will evolve, right? I mean, making predictions about the future of technology is just like a thankless exercise. It's just extremely difficult to see beyond a year or two out. It's very difficult. So my worry is that we don't pay enough attention to this. We don't pay enough attention to the possible negative aspects of it, because people who are controlling it don't want that, because there's money to be made and they don't want to be fettered, by obstacles or regulation. And so they convince the administration that this is the best way to go, right? To me, that is worrisome. So that's my utopia and dystopia thinking for the foreseeable future.
Wonderful. And your book actually does such a great job of giving the lay of the land so we can think about these problems ourselves. Like, the future, of course, is unknown unknowns, but you do such a good job of putting all the facts of the known knowns out there and figuring out the right questions to ask about the known unknowns, as it were, as you've done here as well. My final question to you is, one that you'll be familiar with because it's the way I end all my episodes, which is for me and my listeners, recommend books, music, films, which you have discovered perhaps in the last 5 years, because you must have given a bunch of recommendations in the last episode as well. In the last 5 years, what have you been reading or watching or listening to, which has really stimulated you and you'd like to share with us?
There's just like way too much really amazing content around movies and series and stuff like that. So it just like, that conversation could go on for a long time. In terms of like stuff I've read, I would say that, I don't know, like, and maybe this is like a recency bias on my part, but I thought Anil Seth's book was fascinating. I don't even remember the title. Oh, no, I think it's called Being You, or The Real You. I don't even remember the title. It's embarrassing. But that was a fascinating book. I really enjoyed reading it and thinking about his, notions of like consciousness. Personally, I also loved Tetlock's book, on super forecasting. I loved Kahneman's book on noise, although some people thought that, it's not as good as, Thinking Fast and Slow. I don't know. I thought it was equally good, if not even better, although, Thinking Fast and Slow got people's imagination. Whereas Noise was a little bit different. It was a little, perhaps, more detail or nuance. But, off the top of my mind, those three books come to mind. And then, strangely enough, I've gone back to reading Adam Smith, which I would recommend, and, I'm reading like, people like Hayek, Polanyi, in connection with another, project that I'm working on, that's related to examining, the assumptions of these great thinkers, in an era of AI. But that's sort of work in progress. But I find it fascinating to go back and, read some of these classics.
Fabulous. Vasant, thanks so much for coming on the show. It's so good to have a long chat with you after quite a while.
It has been a while, hasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, always great to chat with you, Amit. Thank you so much for this. Really enjoyed it. What great questions, and I'm glad you like the book. And you tell it like it is.
Thank you. If you enjoyed listening to this episode, check out all 100 episodes of Vasant's podcast, Brave New World. Check out his Substack and head on over to your nearest bookstore, online or offline, and pick up Thinking with Machines by Vasant Dhar. You can follow Vasant on Twitter at Vasant Dhar, that's one word. You can follow me on Twitter at Amit Varma, AmitVarma. You can browse past episodes of The Seen and the Unseen at seenunseen.in and every podcast app of your choice. Thank you for listening. Did you enjoy this episode of The Seen and the Unseen? If so, would you like to support the production of the show? You can go over to seenunseen.in/support and contribute any amount you like to keep this podcast alive and kicking. Thank you.